Around the year 1027 or 1028, a boy was born in the castle of Falaise, in Normandy, northern France. His father, Robert, was the Duke of Normandy, the most powerful man in the land. His mother, Helena, was said to be the daughter of a tanner from the town of Falaise. In medieval Europe, nothing mattered more than lineage. And from the very first second of his birth, this boy carried a label he could never escape: the bastard. These three words would follow him like a shadow through every battlefield and every palace. The term bastard may not carry much weight today, but in 11th century Europe, it was almost equivalent to a curse. It was an era where bloodline determined destiny. Your birth decided what you could and could not have. A bastard, no matter how intelligent or strong, was legally and socially inferior. This label would follow William throughout his life, becoming a weapon his enemies would never let go of. Yet, those who are denied often go further than those who are accepted, because they have no retreat and must keep moving forward. But the Normans themselves were a people who cared little for rules. Their ancestors were Viking pirates who had come south from Scandinavia over 100 years earlier. Around 911 AD, the Viking leader Rollo reached an agreement with the Frankish king, receiving this coastal land as a fief on the condition that they cease their raids and convert to Christianity. Normandy, the name itself means land of the Northmen. By the time William was born, the Normans already spoke French, practiced Christianity, and appeared like French nobility, but deep down, the fierce and adventurous Viking spirit had never truly faded. William's father, Robert, was a man of complex and contradictory character. He seized the dukedom through a fierce power struggle with his elder brother. Rumors suggest that his brother, Richard III, died by his hand. Yet, Robert also displayed remarkable piety and generosity. He showed unexpected paternal love toward William, his illegitimate son, summoning the Norman nobles before his pilgrimage to Jerusalem to demand they recognize the young William as his heir. However, the durability of such oaths often proves astonishingly short in the face of power. In the year 1035, Robert embarked on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land of Jerusalem. This journey was extremely perilous at the time, requiring passage through unfamiliar territories across all of Europe and along the Mediterranean coast. Robert never returned. He fell ill and died in Nicaea, Asia Minor. On his way back, when the news reached Normandy, William was only about 7 or 8 years old. A child, a bastard, thus became the Duke of Normandy, and the power vacuum surrounding a defenseless child immediately attracted wolves who smelled blood. After Robert's death, Normandy immediately fell into chaos. The nobles outwardly acknowledged William's right to succession, but privately, each was calculating, why should a bastard rule over us? The seeds of rebellion quietly ignited in every corner of the duchy. William was the duke in name, but in reality, he could not even guarantee the safety of his own bedroom. His fate entirely depended on the guardians and protectors around him, who could change their loyalties at any moment. The nobles who had once bowed and sworn allegiance before his father now began to reassess their own stakes. William's first guardian was his uncle, Robert, the Archbishop of Rouen. The Archbishop attempted to use the authority of the Church to protect the young Duke. However, the authority of the Church often proved fragile in the face of swords. In that era of survival of the fittest, the protection of an archbishop was far from enough to fend off the Norman military nobles who coveted power. More importantly, the archbishop himself was soon eliminated from this power game. In those times, protecting a child destined to be coveted required not only goodwill, but also strength. What happened next was shocking even in that era, accustomed to violence. William's guardians and protectors were assassinated one after another. His steward, Osborne, was killed in William's bedroom. Yes, in the very room where William slept his tutor, Turold, met the same fate. The first guardian, Count Gilbert of Brienne, was assassinated, and the second did not escape either. Death, like a faithful shadow, clung closely to every adult around the little boy. According to later chronicles, the young William sometimes had to be secretly moved by loyal servants to peasant huts at night to avoid assassination. Imagine the scene: the Duke of Normandy, the future King of England, carried like a fugitive through fields and woods in the darkness, hiding among haystacks and barns. What kind of imprint did such extreme insecurity leave on his young mind? Perhaps it was these nighttime escapes that later made him a man with an almost paranoid obsession with security. In the power struggle surrounding the young Duke, Normandy nearly descended into full-scale civil war. Lords across the region expanded their spheres of influence, building private castles, recruiting armed forces, blocking roads, and imposing tolls. While they nominally pledged loyalty to the Duke, in reality, each acted as a king in his own right. Order in Normandy was crumbling. Laws were failing, and the Duke's authority was evaporating. In the Middle Ages, a ruler incapable of enforcing commands was no different from one who did not exist at all. William's later iron-fisted suppression of private warfare can be directly traced back to these childhood memories. What did young William think and feel during those dark years? Historical records offer no answers. Yet, we can infer from his later actions what this childhood experience left in his heart. His extreme emphasis on loyalty and zero tolerance for betrayal in adulthood. These traits almost certainly stemmed from childhood trauma. A child raised in an environment devoid of security learns a harsh truth. Trust is a luxury, and power is the only reliable safeguard. Yet, there was a glimmer of light in the darkness. Not everyone wanted the child dead. Some Norman nobles, for various reasons, perhaps out of loyalty to Duke Robert, perhaps due to calculations of self-interest, or perhaps simply out of basic human kindness, chose to protect the young William. Among these, the most significant were likely the family of William's mother, Herleva, and some minor nobles who had long-standing alliances with the ducal family. In the most perilous moments, they did not abandon the child. Among these protectors, one name deserves special mention: King Henry of France. It may sound surprising, but during William's youth, the French king was indeed his most important external supporter. The reason was not out of goodwill, but political calculation. A weak Duke of Normandy served the interests of the French crown better than a strong one. A duke in need of the king's protection would naturally become the king's most loyal vassal. Or, so Henry I believed. He would later pay the price for this miscalculation. The chaos in Normandy lasted for nearly a decade. During these 10 years, William grew from a child who needed to be carried to safety into a tall and robust young man. Medieval chroniclers later described him as imposing in stature, exceptionally strong, and possessing a deep, powerful voice. But more important than his physical strength were the lessons he learned during those turbulent years. He learned to recognize hostility behind a smile and detect betrayal beneath a facade of loyalty. These years of walking on the edge of a blade gave him a keen insight into people that his peers could never possess. By the mid-1040s, William was nearing adulthood. He faced a pivotal moment that every young leader raised in adversity encounters. He had to prove through action that he was more than just a duke in name. The nobles of Normandy had watched him grow up, and some still looked down upon this illegitimate son. In their eyes, William was merely a fortunate child who had managed to survive. Now, he had to make these men see him anew. Proving himself for a legitimate heir, this would have been a ceremonial step. In the year 1047, opportunity and crisis arrived simultaneously. A group of nobles from western Normandy, led by Guy of Brittany, launched a large-scale armed rebellion. The rebels' goal was clear: to overthrow the illegitimate duke and replace him with a candidate of their own choosing. This was not a minor disturbance, but a comprehensive challenge that threatened the very foundation of William's rule. The young William faced his first true test of survival. The rebels controlled vast territories in western Normandy and possessed military strength sufficient to challenge the Duke. William did not yet have enough strength to suppress the rebellion on his own. He made a pragmatic and wise choice, seeking help from King Henry of France. Henry agreed to send troops because a weak and grateful Duke of Normandy was the ideal neighbor for the French king. The French army joined forces with William's followers to confront the rebels. This was the first time in William's life that he demonstrated the core strategy he would repeatedly employ in the future without hesitation. He sought external assistance when his own strength was insufficient. Pragmatism is the sharpest weapon in the hands of the weak. The battle on the Val, Face, Dunes Plain in 1047 marked William's first major military victory. Historical records of the battle's details are sparse, but the outcome is certain: the rebels were completely crushed. The significance of this victory extended far beyond the military sphere. It sent a clear message throughout Normandy that this illegitimate son was not a puppet to be easily overthrown. He possessed both the capability and the resolve to defend his power by force. From that day forward, the nobles began to regard their bastard duke with a new perspective. But victory was only the beginning. William's handling of the rebellious nobles after the war foreshadowed his future ruling style: decisive and calculated. He did not carry out large-scale retaliatory massacres. Such actions would only breed more hatred and new rebellions. Instead, he confiscated part of the rebels' lands and redistributed them to loyal followers, while also leaving room for some rebels to turn back. He had already learned that the greatest victory is not to eliminate all enemies, but to turn enough of them into useful tools. After Val-Face-Dunes, William began to undertake what he considered more important than winning battles: systematically establishing his power network in Normandy. He achieved this goal using two tools: castles and people. Castles were the specialty of the Normans. These stone fortresses were the most effective physical means of controlling territory. By constructing or reinforcing castles at strategic locations and placing loyal followers in key positions, William formed a power grid centered around the Duke. Each castle was a nail driven into the body of Normandy. At the same time, he began to cultivate a core circle of followers woven together by personal loyalties. These men did not follow him because of his lineage. The bloodline of a bastard was clearly nothing to boast about. They followed him because he had proven his courage and ability on the battlefield. William bound their interests with land grants and trust, tightly linking their fates to that of the Duke. This system, based on personal loyalty and the exchange of benefits, would become the core template for his future rule over England. While consolidating his internal power, William also demonstrated his shrewdness in religious affairs. He established a close cooperative relationship with the church, sponsoring monasteries, appointing loyal clergy to key ecclesiastical positions, and supporting church reforms. This not only earned him moral and religious legitimacy, but also turned the church into an important auxiliary tool for governing his duchy. In the Middle Ages, controlling the church meant seizing the commanding heights of public opinion and ideology. A duke blessed by the church naturally held a higher moral narrative than a warlord who relied solely on force to maintain rule. Under William's rule, Normandy began to recover from chaos and restore order. Roads became safer, illegally constructed castles were dismantled, and private warfare was severely suppressed. Trade started to revive, and agricultural production stabilized once again. For the ordinary residents of Normandy, it mattered little whether the Duke was a bastard. As long as he could provide order and security, he was a good duke. Order was the best source of legitimacy. As people found that life under the rule of the bastard duke was far better than during the years when legitimate nobles tore each other apart, the issue of his birth became increasingly insignificant. But we should not imagine young William as a mild reformer. His methods of rule were, when necessary, extremely brutal. For those nobles who stubbornly resisted, he did not hesitate to use force to dismantle their castles, confiscate their lands, and expel them from Normandy. During the siege of Alenfein, the defenders hung animal hides on the city walls to mock his mother's origins as a tanner. After capturing the city, William ordered the hands and feet of the captured defenders to be cut off. The word bastard had touched his deepest scar. The Alenfein incident revealed a lifelong pattern in William's character. He could display extraordinary patience and rationality in strategy. But when his origins, that never-healing wound, were touched upon to his face, he would erupt into a fury bordering on loss of control. Most of the time, he was a strategist, so calm as to be almost cold-blooded. But the word bastard acted like a hidden switch. Once triggered, the rationality within him would instantly give way to rage. Understanding this trigger is to understand the deepest psychological code of William the Man. By the early 1050s, William, then in his early 20s, had transformed Normandy from a chaotic duchy on the brink of collapse into one of the most powerful and well-ordered territories in northern France. He accomplished this transformation in less than a decade, evolving from a teenage duke constantly at risk of assassination into a formidable ruler whom none of his neighbors dared to underestimate. Yet, this was far from the end. History was preparing a stage for him far grander than Normandy itself. Looking back at William's childhood and youth reveals a surprising pattern. His life trajectory bears a striking resemblance to that of many great conquerors in history. Thrown into desperate circumstances by fate, forced to mature early in an environment devoid of security, he learned to make calm judgments amid danger and rose from the ruins with an iron will. Genghis Khan endured similar trials on the steppes, and Alexander experienced comparable bloody power struggles in the Macedonian court. Adversity does not create greatness, but it serves as a brutal sieve. Is this similarity a mere coincidence? Perhaps not entirely. Extreme adversity can indeed forge a certain kind of exceptional leadership, an extraordinary sensitivity to danger, a profound intuition for the workings of power, and an unyielding iron will that refuses to bow to fate. However, adversity does not only shape the strong, it also produces countless crushed failures. William's ability to rise above the same adversity was not solely due to his will. He also needed luck, allies, and a sufficiently chaotic era to provide opportunities. William's story has only just completed its prologue. A bastard survived amidst the clash of swords, learned to rule through rebellion and assassination, and established order in the midst of chaos. But Normandy was merely his starting point, not his destination. Across the English Channel, an older, wealthier, and prouder kingdom was experiencing its own crisis. And this crisis would present William with the greatest opportunity of his life. King Edward, the Confessor of England, had no heirs, leaving the succession to the throne unresolved. How does a man cursed by his bloodline rewrite his fate with an iron will? The first chapter sets the starting point of the story. A bastard not only survives in the most unlikely environment, but also begins to make his voice heard, the trace that will one day shake all of Europe: ruthless rationality, extreme emphasis on loyalty, and precise political calculations are all rooted in his childhood during the bloody dawn of Normandy. In the next chapter, the hammer blows on the anvil will continue to fall, forging this metal into an even sharper edge. The victory at Val. Hastings allowed young William to secure his footing in Normandy, but winning a single battle was far from establishing stable rule. The challenges before him were manifold. Internally, disgruntled nobles still lurked, waiting for an opportunity, while externally, neighboring powers, the King of France, the Count of Anjou, and the Duke of Brittany, each schemed to take a bite out of the rich prize. That was Normandy. Over the next decade or so, William faced the daunting task of transforming a military triumph into enduring political authority and reshaping a duchy torn by rebellion into a well-functioning machinery of governance. William's first step in consolidating his power was to systematically dismantle the castles that had been built without authorization by local lords during the chaotic years of his childhood. In medieval Normandy, castles were not merely fortifications, but physical embodiments of power. Each one signified actual control over dozens of square kilometers of land and the people living there. In his youth, William had witnessed firsthand how these privately constructed castles fragmented Normandy into small, independent kingdoms. Now he was determined to establish an ironclad rule. Only the Duke had the authority to build and hold castles. This principle would later be carried to England and become one of the most important cornerstones of the Norman system of rule. While dismantling castles, William was also constructing his own. He built a series of fortresses loyal to the Duke at strategic locations in Normandy, river crossings, road junctions, and border areas. Each castle was garrisoned by individuals he personally selected and trusted. These castles were not only military strongholds, but also administrative centers and visible symbols of ducal authority. When a peasant looked up at the stone fortress on the hill, he saw not just a wall, but the promise of the Duke's power and order. William understood, earlier and more profoundly than most rulers of his time, the immense value of architecture as a language of power. Beyond military and political means, William also actively utilized the church to consolidate his rule. He promoted monastic reforms in Normandy, supported strict Benedictine norms, sponsored the construction of new monasteries and churches, and appointed clergy recognized for their learning and integrity to key positions. These measures earned him the full support of the church in a society with extremely low literacy rates. The clergy were the only group capable of systematically producing and disseminating narratives. When the church praised the Duke's piety and justice in its sermons, such praise resonated more deeply with the people than any military victory. Around 1049 to 1052, William made a decision that profoundly impacted both his personal fate and European history. He proposed to Matilda, the daughter of Baldwin V, Count of Flanders. Flanders was Normandy's most powerful neighbor to the northeast, and this marriage meant gaining a strong ally and cutting off the possibility of the French king encircling Normandy from the east. However, this union was far more than just a political calculation. Later events proved that there was a genuine emotional bond between William and Matilda, in an era when marriages were almost entirely transactions of power. This sincerity made their partnership far more resilient than any purely interest-based alliance. There is a widely circulated legend about this marriage. Matilda initially refused William's proposal, claiming she did not wish to marry a bastard. Upon hearing this, William rode to Bruges, grabbed Matilda by her braid in the street, and threw her to the ground. The authenticity of this story cannot be confirmed. It is more likely a romanticized fabrication from later times rather than historical fact. However, the reason this legend has endured may be that it accurately captures a certain essence of William's character. He would not accept any form of rejection, especially one based on his birth. The true beginning of this relationship remains a mystery, but its outcome is certain. After entering William's life, Matilda quickly proved to be far more than just a tool for political alliance. She was a highly capable woman, serving as regent and managing the affairs of the duchy during William's frequent absences on Norman expeditions or diplomatic missions. Her administrative skills earned widespread recognition among the Norman nobility, which was highly unusual in an era when women rarely held public power. The extent of William's trust in her is clearly demonstrated by the fact that during his prolonged military campaign to conquer England, the entire Norman homeland, we traced it to Matilda's full authority. The marriage of William and Matilda also left a profound material legacy, the Bayeux Tapestry. This approximately 70-meter long embroidered work meticulously depicts the entire process of the Norman conquest of England and is widely believed by many scholars to have been commissioned or sponsored under Matilda's direction. Although this attribution remains debated in academic circles, the tapestry itself stands as one of the most significant visual narratives of the Middle Ages and continues to serve as the most vivid pictorial source for understanding the events of 1066. It tells a story written with swords and blood, using thread and needle. While William was busy consolidating his rule and managing his marriage in Normandy, his relationship with his most important external ally, King Henry of France, was undergoing a dangerous shift. Henry I had initially supported the young William out of political calculation. A weak Duke of Normandy was the ideal vassal for the French king. But now, this calculation was backfiring. William was not only failing to become a compliant vassal, but was also transforming Normandy into the most powerful territory in northern France. A neighbor strong enough to potentially threaten the French king himself was the last thing Henry I wanted to see. Around 1052 to 1054, Henry I made a decision. He would use military means to curb William's rise. The French king allied with Count Geoffrey Martel of Anjou, another neighbor deeply uneasy about Normandy's expansion, forming a joint force to invade Normandy simultaneously from both the north and south. This was the most severe military threat William had faced since Dunes. The king who had once extended a helping hand during his most vulnerable time, now personally led an army to destroy him. William had to find a way to break through this pincer movement. Otherwise, everything he had built over 10 years would be reduced to nothing within weeks. Faced with a pincer attack from two directions, William demonstrated the same calm strategic judgment he would later show at the Battle of Hastings. He did not attempt to fight on both fronts simultaneously. Doing so with Normandy's forces at the time would have been tantamount to suicide. Instead, he adopted a strategy of concentrating his forces to defeat the enemy one by one. He first dispatched an elite force to intercept the northern column of the French king's allied army at Mortemer. This decision carried immense risk if the northern interception failed, while the main southern force of the French king simultaneously penetrated deep into Normandy. The Duke would face utter disaster. But William's gamble paid off. The Battle of Mortemer in 1054 ended with a decisive victory for the Norman army. The northern column of the French royal coalition suffered heavy losses in an ambush, with its commander captured and a large number of soldiers either killed or taken prisoner. When news of this reached Henry, who was leading the main southern force, the French king made a decision that was nothing short of perfect for William. He chose to retreat a pincer offensive that could have crushed Normandy, thus completely collapsed due to the devastating defeat of one flank. William did not have to defeat the entire coalition. He only needed to defeat half of it, and the other half would simply walk away. This is a textbook case of strategic efficiency. However, Henry was not one to easily admit defeat. Around 1057, the French king once again assembled a larger coalition army to invade Normandy. This time, he learned from the mistake of dividing his forces and attempted to concentrate his troops for a breakthrough from a single direction. The coalition army crossed the Dives River and advanced deep into Normandy. burning villages and plundering supplies along the way. A standard tactic in medieval warfare aimed at undermining the enemy's economic foundation. William once again faced a choice: to engage in a direct confrontation or to wait for an opportunity. He chose the latter, because he knew that an invading army was most vulnerable, not during its advance, but during its retreat. The Battle of Varaville in 1057 stands as one of the most representative victories in William's military career. When the French allied forces crossed the Dives River estuary during high tide, their army was split into two separate segments by the river. Seizing this fleeting opportunity, William led the Norman cavalry in a fierce assault on the rear portion of the Allied forces, which had not yet completed the crossing. The outcome was devastating. The isolated French rearguard suffered a slaughter on the riverbank, unable to receive any support from the vanguard that had already crossed. Henry I watched helplessly from the opposite shore as his army was annihilated piece by piece. After Val-Face-Dunes, Henry I never attempted to invade Normandy again. 2 invasions, 2 disastrous defeats. The French king finally accepted a painful reality. The bastard boy he had once supported with his own hands had now grown into a formidable opponent he could no longer suppress. Not only did William secure Normandy, but he also greatly enhanced his prestige and deterrence throughout northern France through 2 defensive battles. From a youth who needed the French king's troops to quell rebellions to an adult ruler, who forced the French king's personal campaigns to end in failure, this transformation took only 10 years. In the year 1060, fate delivered 2 profoundly significant obituaries to William. King Henry of France and Count Geoffrey Martel of Anjou, his 2 most formidable external adversaries in Normandy, passed away within the same year. Henry I's successor, Philip I, was still a child. While the Anjou territories descended into a chaotic succession dispute, the 2 towering walls in William's external environment crumbled in the same year. Some might call it luck, but luck only favors those who are prepared. Had William not spent the past decade transforming Normandy into a stable and powerful state internally, the deaths of these 2 rivals would have meant nothing to him. The removal of external pressures allowed William to turn his attention toward more ambitious directions. In the early 1050s and 1060s, Normandy underwent a comprehensive upgrade. He reformed the military organization, requiring vassals to provide a fixed number of cavalry based on the size of their territories. This institutionalized military obligation enabled him to quickly assemble a considerable army when needed. He continued to strengthen the castle network, improve administrative management, and enhance tax efficiency. Normandy was being systematically transformed into an efficient machine for war and governance. Though at the time, he may not have known exactly what the next target of this machine would be. During this period, William also undertook a crucial task for the future conquest of England. He vigorously developed Normandy's naval power and shipbuilding industry. Normandy itself boasted a long coastline and excellent harbors. After all, the ancestors of the Normans were the seafaring Viking pirates. William encouraged shipbuilding activities in coastal towns and expanded port facilities. While these investments may have seemed like routine territorial management at the time, they would later form the foundation for William's fleet to invade England. Preparation first, opportunity later. This was a principle William repeatedly validated throughout his life. Let us temporarily shift our gaze across the English Channel to the island nation that would become William's ultimate goal. In the early 1060s, England was in a delicate and precarious political balance. King Edward the Confessor ruled the kingdom, but he had no heirs, meaning his death would trigger a major succession crisis. At least 3 forces were quietly vying for the future English throne. William's Norman faction, the powerful English noble family of Godwin, and the Norwegian royal house from Scandinavia in the north. Edward the Confessor was a king so devout that he seemed almost detached from worldly affairs. He devoted considerable energy to religious matters, particularly the reconstruction of Westminster Abbey, while showing limited interest in the political and military affairs of his kingdom. More crucially, he had deep ties with Normandy. His mother was the daughter of the Duke of Normandy, and he himself spent 25 years in exile there. According to Norman records, Edward allegedly promised the throne to William around 1051. Though it should be noted that this claim primarily originates from Norman sources, while traditional English historical accounts present different narratives. In England, true power was not held by the king, but by the great noble families led by the Godwin clan. Earl Harold Godwinson was the most powerful and militarily capable figure in England. His family controlled the wealthiest southern territories, and he himself had demonstrated exceptional leadership in numerous military campaigns. When it became clear to all that Edward, the Confessor, was nearing the end of his life, Harold emerged as the strongest local contender for the throne. In Anglo-Saxon tradition, the election of a king was not solely determined by lineage. The endorsement of the Witan also carried legitimacy. In approximately 1064, an event occurred that remains highly controversial to this day. Harold arrived in Normandy for reasons unknown and was received by William with the honors of a distinguished guest. Norman records claim that Harold swore an oath on holy relics to support William's claim to the English throne. This oath later became the central legal justification for William's invasion of England. However, the details of the event are primarily found in Norman sources, while English traditional narratives offer different interpretations regarding the context and legal validity of the oath. Regardless of the truth, the oath was imbued with immense symbolic significance by both sides in the ensuing struggle, a matter that would ultimately be decided on the battlefield. Regardless of the precise details of this oath, it played an irreplaceable role in William's political narrative. In the medieval Christian world, an oath sworn upon holy relics held the highest level of binding force. Breaking such an oath was not only a political betrayal, but also a blasphemy against God, a sin that would invite the punishment of hell. William later leveraged this very point to successfully secure the Pope's support, transforming his invasion of England from a blatant military conquest into a righteous war waged to uphold a sacred oath. The power of narrative can sometimes rival that of an army. By the end of 1065, all the pieces were nearly in place. William had a secure Norman rear, a well-trained military force, a legal narrative regarding the succession to the English throne, however contentious it might be, and a sense of urgency brought on by the increasingly frail English king, who could die at any moment. Meanwhile, Harold Hardrada of Norway was also eyeing the English throne, claiming historical rights to northern England based on Danish. Norwegian heritage, England was like a piece of iron caught between three pincers, and the furnace was already glowing red-hot. In the final period of waiting for the right moment, William completed his transformation from a local ruler of Normandy into a politician with an international perspective. He was no longer merely managing a duchy. He was orchestrating a multinational chess game involving the Pope, France, Flanders, Norway, and England. Every move he made was meticulously calculated. His marriage alliance with Flanders secured the eastern flank. The youth of the French king ensured the southern flank remained untroubled. The Pope's support guaranteed the moral high ground, and the militarization of Normandy ensured he possessed the hard power to execute it all. Looking back at Chapter 2, we can clearly see a complete arc of transformation from youth to adulthood. The inexperienced youth of Val-Face-Dunes, after 15 years of trials, evolved into an iron-fisted ruler who defeated the allied forces of the French king. He managed a rare political marriage with genuine affection, achieved a comprehensive militarization and administrative modernization of Normandy, and strategically positioned himself in the struggle for the English throne. This was not a stroke of genius, but a systematic, long-term endeavor. Perhaps His greatest talent was not any single ability, but the comprehensive quality of weaving all his capabilities into a cohesive overall strategy. The Duke on the anvil has been forged into a sharp sword. In the next chapter, this sword will point across the English Channel. In January 1066, Edward the Confessor will close his eyes. Harold will don the crown, and William will face a choice he has waited a lifetime for: to accept reality or to cross the sea and seize all he claims as his own. For a man who learned in childhood never to bow to fate, the answer requires almost no thought. He has never been one to accept reality. He is the one who rewrites it. When fate knocks, he will not hesitate, for he has spent a lifetime preparing for this day. On the 5th of January 1066, Edward the Confessor, King of England, passed away at Westminster Palace in London. His death was not sudden. The devout king's health had been deteriorating steadily in his final years, and everyone knew this day would come sooner or later. Yet, when it finally arrived, it still struck like a massive stone thrown into calm waters. For Edward left behind no direct heirs, and his arrangements for the succession, if he ever made any clear ones, remain a subject of heated debate among historians to this day. Edward's legacy was not an heir but a storm, a perfect storm of a three-way struggle for power. The news of Edward's death had not yet spread across the country when one man swiftly took action. On the very next day after Edward's passing, the 6th of January 1066, Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey in London. This speed was highly unusual for the Middle Ages. It typically took weeks or even months of negotiation and preparation from a king's death to the coronation of a new monarch. Harold's lightning. Fast coronation indicated two things. First, he had long been thoroughly prepared for this moment. Second, he was acutely aware that if he gave his rivals time, his throne could face challenges. Harold's claim to the throne was, at least formally, legitimate within England. The Anglo-Saxon political tradition included an institution known as the Wittenage-Mot, composed of the kingdom's leading nobles and church leaders, which held the authority to elect and confirm kings. Harold asserted that he had lawfully ascended to the throne through the election of the Wittenage-Mot. More crucially, he also claimed that Edward the Confessor, on his deathbed, had entrusted the kingdom to him in the presence of those around him. This account of the deathbed bequest, which directly contradicted the Norman claim of an earlier promise of the throne, also primarily originates from English sources. The news quickly crossed the English Channel. When William learned of Edward's death and Harold's coronation in Normandy, chroniclers recorded that he was hunting in a game park near Rouen. A famous account describes his reaction upon receiving the news. He gripped his bow and remained silent for a long time, with no one around daring to speak. Whether this detail is accurate is impossible to verify, but the meaning it conveys is clear. It was not rage or surprise, but the breathless, intense focus of a hunter who had waited a long time and finally saw his prey appear. William knew this moment would come sooner or later, and he had been preparing for it for over a decade. In William's view, Harold's actions were not merely a political usurpation, but a blatant betrayal of a sacred oath. Within the Norman narrative, Harold had sworn on holy relics to support William's claim to the throne, a claim that, as previously noted, was interpreted quite differently on the English side. But for William, the truth was irrelevant. What mattered was the narrative. He did not need objective facts, but a story compelling enough to convince the Norman nobility, the Pope, and the entire Christian world. Harold was a perjurer who had broken a holy vow, and William was the righteous sword chosen by God to punish the oath breaker and reclaim the crown that was rightfully his. However compelling the narrative may be, it alone cannot launch a war. William's first and most difficult challenge was to persuade the Norman nobles to support his plan for an expedition to England. These nobles were not William's subordinates, but his vassals. Under the feudal system, they were obligated to provide military service for the Duke's defensive wars, but they had no legal duty to participate in an overseas expedition, an offensive venture of this nature. William could not command them. He could only persuade them. This meant he had to convince each individual that the risks of the expedition were worth taking and that the potential rewards were sufficiently substantial. William convened a crucial assembly of nobles in Lillebonne. At this meeting, he demonstrated exceptional political persuasion. Instead of directly demanding that the nobles join his expedition, he first had one of his most trusted deputies, most notably William Fitzosborne, engage with the nobles privately, making varied promises to different individuals: land, castles, titles, and wealth in England. Then, during the public session of the assembly, Fitzosborne took the lead in expressing collective support for the expedition on behalf of the group. This assembly marked a political starting point for William's campaign to England. Under the feudal system, a duke's power relied on the voluntary cooperation of his vassals rather than absolute commands. After persuading the Norman nobles, William immediately set out to secure support from a higher authority, Pope Alexander II. He dispatched envoys to Rome to present his claim to the English throne in detail to the papal court. The arguments brought by the envoys included King Edward's earlier promise, Harold's oath on holy relics, and his subsequent betrayal, and the various irregularities within the English Church under the leadership of Archbishop Stephen. The envoys' presentation captured the issues most concerning to the papal court: church reform and the Pope's authority over local churches. The essence of politics is not a black and white moral judgment, but a delicate alignment of different interests. Pope Alexander II ultimately decided to support William's cause. He bestowed upon William a papal banner, an immensely significant symbol in the Middle Ages. The Pope's support significantly enhanced the religious legitimacy of the expedition, allowing William to elevate the invasion from a blatant territorial conquest to a just war imbued with a sacred mission. However, we must also understand that the Pope's decision was driven by complex political considerations. Supporting William helped the papacy promote church reforms in England and create a new balance of power between France and England. These calculations were far more intricate than mere religious justice. While making breakthroughs on the diplomatic front, William was also advancing his military logistics preparations at full speed. His greatest physical challenge was how to transport a large-scale army across the English Channel. Although Normandy had a shipbuilding tradition and port facilities, the existing vessels were far from sufficient to carry an expeditionary force. William ordered the simultaneous launch of large-scale shipbuilding projects at multiple ports along the Normandy coast. This was a remarkable logistical achievement within approximately 6 to 8 months. It is commonly estimated by scholars that hundreds of transport ships and warships were constructed. Each vessel was crafted from raw logs by Norman artisans, one axe and hammer at a time. Transport vessels were part of the logistical challenge. William also needed to ensure that the expeditionary force could immediately engage in battle after crossing the sea, rather than being picked off one by one in the chaos of landing. This meant he had to transport horses, the core combat strength of medieval cavalry, across the Channel. Using 11th century wooden ships to transport large numbers of war horses across dozens of kilometers of open water was a highly challenging technical problem. At the time, William's team designed specialized horse transport ships, widening the hulls to lower the center of gravity and installing partitions to secure the horses, along with ramps so the animals could walk directly from the ships onto the beach. This spirit of pragmatic innovation was the hallmark of the Normans. By August 1066, the preparations for the Norman expedition were largely complete. Scholarly estimates commonly suggest that the total force assembled along the coast of Normandy numbered between 7,000 and over 10,000 troops. This included approximately 2,000 to 3,000 cavalry, along with a larger number of infantry and archers. The army was not limited to Normans alone. It also attracted adventurous knights from Brittany, Flanders, other parts of France, and even Norman settlements in southern Italy. Their motivations varied. Some were William's vassals fulfilling their obligations. Others were lured by the promise of land and wealth in England, while some sought adventure and glory for its own sake. However, just as everything was ready, fate presented William with the most agonizing challenge. The wind, the autumn winds in the English Channel, were unpredictable, and William's fleet needed a favorable southerly wind to safely cross. Starting in August, William's army gathered at the mouth of the Dives River on the Normandy coast, awaiting the opportune moment to set sail. But the wind remained unfavorable. Day after day, northerly or westerly winds blew, firmly anchoring his fleet in the harbor. A month of waiting might not seem like much in modern times, but in the 11th century, it was almost unheard of for a feudal army to remain in port for an entire month. During this prolonged period of waiting, William demonstrated one of the most impressive qualities of his character: the ability to remain composed under immense pressure. He did not make rash decisions out of anxiety, such as forcing a voyage under unfavorable winds, nor did he give up after waiting too long. Each day, he inspected the military camp, conversed with generals and soldiers, and maintained discipline and cohesion within the army. He organized religious ceremonies to pray to God for favorable winds, while also ensuring the uninterrupted supply of provisions from a material standpoint. It was precisely during this month that the Vikings invaded the north, forcing Harold to dispatch his elite forces far away. Sometimes, fate expresses its goodwill through delays. While waiting for a favorable wind, something William could never have dreamed of was happening on the other side of the English Channel. Fate was clearing obstacles for him in a way he could not foresee. In September 1066, King Harald Hardrada of Norway led a massive Viking fleet to invade northern England. Harold was a legendary figure. He had served in the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Empire, fought in countless battles from the Mediterranean to the Middle East, and was hailed as the last Viking hero in Northern Europe. He claimed the right to the English throne through the historical Danish-Norwegian lineage. Harold's invading forces swept through northern England with unstoppable momentum. Advancing inland along the Humber River, they defeated the local armies of the northern Earls Edwin and Morcar, capturing the city of York on the 20th of September. The entire north of England trembled under the Viking onslaught. When the news reached London in the south, Harold, who had been monitoring the southern coast of England in preparation for a Norman invasion, faced a brutal dilemma. If he remained in the south to guard against William, the north might fall completely if he marched north to confront the Vikings. A deadly gap would open in the southern coastal defenses. Harold chose what he perceived as the most immediate threat, heading north. What followed showcased Harold's most admirable quality as a military commander: speed. Leading the elite English housecarls from London, he marched north at an astonishing pace, covering approximately 300 kilometers in about 4 to 5 days to reach the vicinity of York. This rate of march was nearly unimaginable in the Middle Ages. It meant the army moved 60 to 70 kilometers per Dalton Way along the autumn roads of England. Harold did not wait for reinforcements from the northern shires to assemble. He gambled that the Vikings would not anticipate the English main force appearing before them with such swiftness. Speed was his most trusted weapon, yet each use of this weapon wore it down a little more. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was the first of 3 decisive battles in 1066 that determined the fate of England. On the 25th of September, Harold's army suddenly appeared before the unprepared Viking forces. Harold's troops were not even fully armored. They clearly had not anticipated the English main force arriving so quickly. The outcome of the battle was decisive. Both Harold Hardrada and Tostig fell in combat, and the invading Viking army was almost completely annihilated. It is recorded that the army, which required 300 ships for the invasion, needed only 24 ships after the battle. However, the glory of Stamford Bridge would soon become his heaviest burden. Harold had won a brilliant victory, yet the cruelty of fate lies in the fact that it grants victors far too little time to celebrate. Just 2 or 3 days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, a messenger arrived in York from the south, bearing news that chilled Harold's blood, William, Duke of Normandy, had taken advantage of a sudden shift to southerly winds and crossed the English Channel on the 28th of September, landing successfully at Pevensey Bay in Sussex, southern England. The second front Harold had most feared had finally opened at the very moment he was farthest from the south. Fate had granted him glory, only to demand a price immediately, and the price was far heavier than the glory. Let's return to the other side of the channel to observe William's crossing operation. On the night of the 27th of September, the wind finally shifted to a favorable southerly direction. Without hesitation, William ordered the entire army to board the ships within hours. Hundreds of transport vessels, laden with soldiers, horses, and supplies, sailed out of the harbor under the cover of darkness, forming a column guided by the lights of the Duke's flagship as they headed toward the northern coast of England. This was one of the largest maritime military operations in medieval Europe. Thousands of men and hundreds of war horses crossed a channel that could turn treacherous at any moment on an autumn night, remaining calm in the face of the greatest uncertainty. This calmness itself is the highest form of leadership. On the morning of the 28th of September, William's fleet arrived at Pevensey Bay in Sussex, southern England. During the landing, a widely recounted anecdote is said to have occurred. William stumbled and fell on the beach as he disembarked. In the superstitious beliefs of the Middle Ages, this would have been considered an extremely ominous sign. However, William, or someone quick-witted around him, immediately turned the accident into a favorable omen. He grabbed 2 handfuls of English soil and declared, "I have seized this land with both hands." The landing was completed without any resistance, as Harold and his army were over 300 kilometers away in York at the time. After landing, William made a decision that seemed risky, but was actually extremely shrewd. Instead of immediately advancing inland, he established defensive positions along the coastal area between Pevensey and Hastings, constructing temporary fortresses. This decision was based on several considerations. First, he needed to secure his retreat. His fleet and supply lines had to be protected. Second, by choosing to remain on the coast, rather than venturing deep inland, he was essentially forcing Harold to come and attack him, instead of pursuing a local king who knew every road and forest in unfamiliar territory. William wanted the enemy to come to him, not the other way around. At the same time, William also ordered systematic plundering and burning in the surrounding areas of the landing zone. This practice, which is abhorrent today, held a cold rationality within the military logic of the Middle Ages. Its purpose was not only to secure supplies for the army, but also to instill fear, sending a message to the English. If your king does not come to protect you, you will lose everything. This was essentially a tactic to force Harold to abandon any possibility of delay and quickly lead his army south for a decisive battle. William needed a swift victory. His forces were an invading army fighting on foreign soil. And with each passing day of delay, the situation grew increasingly unfavorable for him. Harold's response, upon receiving news of William's landing, once again demonstrated his decisiveness as a military commander. But this time, that decisiveness may have been fatal. He neither rested in York to await reinforcements from the north. Nor adopted the strategy, reportedly suggested by some advisors, of holding London and engaging William in a protracted war after he advanced inland. Instead, he made the exact same choice as when he marched north to confront the Vikings. He led his army south to meet the enemy at the fastest possible speed. According to records, he made a brief stop in London to replenish some troops, but did not wait for the full arrival of the main northern forces. The core of his army remained the exhausted soldiers who had marched all the way back from York. On the evening of the 13th of October, 1066, Harold's army arrived at Senlac Hill, about 10 kilometers north of Hastings. William's forces were near Hastings to the south. The distance between the two armies was only a few hours' march, in an era without satellites, radios, or even accurate maps. Both commanders were estimating each other's positions and strength in the dark. The dawn of the following day would unveil the prelude to one of the most significant battles in medieval Europe. Before the battle began, no one could foresee the outcome. Harold held the advantage of fighting on home ground with a seasoned and elite infantry. Dawn broke slowly over Senlac Hill in Sussex, southern England, on the 14th of October, 1066. This day would become the most significant watershed in English history. Before it, England was an Anglo-Saxon kingdom. After it, the land would be utterly reshaped by a group of Normans from across the Channel. Yet no one among the two armies standing on either side of the hill knew this. All they knew was that a fierce battle awaited them that day, and those who lived to see the sunrise tomorrow would determine the future course of this island nation. Senlac Hill was not tall. Its elevation was merely 70 or 80 meters. But the historical weight it was about to bear could have crushed any true mountain. Let us first examine the forces and positions of both sides. Harold's English army occupied the summit of Senlac Hill, an excellent defensive position. The front of the hill was a gentle slope, while its flanks were protected by dense woods and marshes, meaning the Norman forces could only launch a frontal assault uphill and could not outflank them. The core of Harold's army consisted of elite housecarls, well-equipped, highly trained professional warriors. Surrounding the housecarls were militiamen conscripted from various shires, whose equipment and training varied widely, but who were numerous in number. Estimates of the exact troop numbers on both sides vary significantly among scholars, but most studies suggest they were roughly equal, each ranging between 7,000 and 10,000 men. The terrain advantage and defensive posture gave the English a favorable position even before the battle began. The tactical core of the English army was the shield wall, a classic defensive formation that had been used for centuries in Norse and Anglo-Saxon military traditions. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder in tight horizontal rows, linking their large round shields or kite shields to form an almost seamless barrier in front of them, with the tips of spears and battle axes protruding above the shields. In a defensive stance, the shield wall was nearly impossible to breach head on. Cavalry charging up a gentle slope would face a solid wall of wood, iron, and human bodies. Harold's tactical intent was clear. Use the shield wall to withstand the Norman assaults, wear down their stamina and morale, and wait for the enemy to exhaust themselves through repeated charges before launching a counterattack. Below the hill, the Norman army, under William's command, was arranged in 3 lines. The first line consisted of archers and crossbowmen, responsible for long-range fire suppression. The second line was made up of heavy infantry, clad in chainmail, armed with spears and swords. The third line held William's greatest tactical advantage, the Norman heavy cavalry, mounted on powerful steeds and wielding lances. These knights were the most formidable military force in 11th century Western Europe. The army was divided horizontally into 3 columns. The left wing composed of Bretons, the center of the main Norman force, and the right wing of allied French and Flemish troops. William himself rode behind the central column, able to observe the entire battlefield and personally join the fight when necessary. 3 lines, 3 types of troops, a meticulously designed killing machine awaited the signal to begin. At around 9 in the morning, upon William's command, the Norman archers launched their first volley at the English positions on the hill. Hundreds of arrows cut through the October morning sky, raining down on the English lines. However, the results were disappointing. The English, standing atop the hill with the high ground, caused most of the arrows shot upward by the archers below to either strike their shields or fly over their heads. More critically, the English army had almost no archers to return fire, which meant the Norman archers could not retrieve arrows that had landed in enemy lines to replenish their ammunition. The first wave of ranged attacks failed to achieve the intended suppressive effect. The shield wall remained intact and unmoving atop the hill. After the archers' attack failed, the Norman infantry began to charge up the hill to the sound of war drums and horns. The heavy infantry struggled up the slippery October grass slope, each step made more difficult by the weight of their armor and weapons. When they breathlessly reached the shield wall, they were met with battle, axes and javelins hurled down by the English from above. The Anglo-Saxon two-handed Danish battle. Axe was a fearsome weapon. A trained warrior could split a shield and the man behind it with a single blow. The infantry charge shattered against the shield wall, forced to retreat down the hill to regroup. After suffering heavy casualties, the first phase of the morning ended in a complete victory for the English. After the infantry was thwarted, William played his biggest trump card, the Norman cavalry. Hundreds of fully armored knights spurred their horses up the hillside, attempting to tear through the shield wall with the immense impact of a cavalry charge. This might have been feasible on flat ground. The force of a medieval cavalry charge was nearly impossible for infantry to withstand head-on, however. Facing a well-prepared shield wall on an uphill slope was an entirely different situation. As the horses charged up the slope, their speed and momentum significantly diminished, confronted with dense formations of spears and battle axes. The horses were either startled or stabbed and fell, while knights who tumbled from their mounts struggled to stand up in their heavy armor. The cavalry charge, William's most prized tactical advantage, also met its match against the shield wall at Senlac Hill. By late morning, the battle situation had become quite unfavorable for William. The long-range suppression by archers proved ineffective, the frontal assault of the infantry was thwarted, and the cavalry's charge failed to break through the shield wall. All 3 of his initial strategies had been exhausted in the first round. To make matters worse, during a retreat after a failed attack, the Breton contingent on the left flank panicked and collapsed, with soldiers discarding their armor and fleeing down the hill to the flat ground. This panic began to spread to the center. At this critical moment, a deadly rumor circulated among the Norman army that the Duke had been killed. For a feudal army primarily held together by personal loyalty, the death of the commander meant that the reason to continue fighting vanished instantly. This was the first turning point of the entire battle, and a critical moment that showcased William's personal courage and leadership. William made a move that was nearly insane in the context of the battlefield at the time. He removed his helmet, rode to the front of the retreating soldiers, revealed his face, and shouted loudly, "I am here. I am not dead. Look at me!" For a commander to remove his helmet on the battlefield meant exposing himself completely to enemy arrows and weapons. A gamble that could cost his life in mere seconds. But William bet that his soldiers needed to see him alive more than he needed to preserve his own life. The gamble succeeded. When the Norman soldiers saw that their Duke was not only alive, but also at the front lines, the momentum of the retreat was halted. It was during this retreat and stabilization that William, or perhaps the chance of the battlefield, discovered a crucial phenomenon that would change the course of the battle. As the Bretons retreated, some of the English defenders, seeing the enemy flee, could not resist the impulse to give chase. They broke out of the shield wall and pursued them downhill. These English soldiers, now separated from their formation, were quickly cut down by the reorganized Norman cavalry on level ground. The strength of the shield wall lay in its unity. Once individual soldiers left it to pursue, they became easy targets for the cavalry as scattered troops. This discovery, whether an intentional tactical innovation or a chance observation on the battlefield, was about to be systematically exploited by William. Around midday, the battle entered its second phase, the core tactic being the feigned retreat, which has been widely discussed in later generations. Historians have long debated the use of the feigned retreat at Hastings. Was it a sophisticated tactic planned by William, or an immediate exploitation of a chance event? Those who support the pre-planned theory point out that Norman cavalry had records of feigned retreats in other battles. Those who argue for immediate exploitation believe that, under the communication conditions of the 11th century, it would have been nearly impossible for hundreds of cavalry to execute a coordinated feigned retreat with precision. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. An accidental rout inspired deliberate repetition. In any case, the outcome was certain. Over the next few hours, the Normans repeatedly employed the deadly cycle of retreating to lure pursuit and then turning to counterattack. The effect of the feigned retreat tactic is gradual, rather than instantaneous. Each feigned retreat could only lure a small portion of the English away from the shield wall. Most seasoned warriors could see through the ruse. Yet, even if only dozens or even a dozen men were drawn out each time, repeated maneuvers steadily depleted the shield wall's manpower. More critically, each feigned retreat created a temporary gap in the wall. As some gave chase, their vacated positions left a vulnerable point that could be exploited. Even if these gaps were quickly filled, the repeated strain gradually eroded the overall strength of the shield wall. This was a war of attrition, and victory in such a conflict belongs to the side that endures to the end. The entire afternoon saw the brutal battle oscillate between repeated charges, feigned retreats, and shield wall defenses. The slopes of Senlac Hill were strewn with the bodies of Normans and Englishmen. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, yet neither could decisively overpower the other. It is recorded that William lost 3 horses that day, meaning he was not commanding from the rear, but repeatedly plunged into the fiercest close-quarters combat himself. At his side, at least 2 key commanders were wounded in battle. Across the field, Harold remained at the forefront of the shield wall, his dragon banner and battle standard marking his position, serving as an anchor for the morale of the English army. Both leaders were pouring their own lives into fueling the fighting spirit of their respective forces. As evening fell, the decisive moment that would determine the outcome of the battle finally arrived. After nearly 8 hours of continuous fighting, the English shield wall, though still holding, had significantly weakened. Too many men had broken formation during the feigned retreat, and too many had been killed, wounded, or exhausted in the prolonged combat. It was at this moment, according to most historical accounts, that King Harold of England fell in battle. Historical records offer different versions of his exact cause of death. The most famous account claims he was struck in the eye by an arrow descending from the sky. But this interpretation largely stems from a particular scene in the Bayeux Tapestry, the meaning of which remains debated among scholars. Regardless of how Harold actually died, his death had an immediate and catastrophic impact. On the battlefield, the English shield wall quickly disintegrated upon learning of the king's demise. The most loyal warriors of the royal guard made a final stand around Harold's body, but were soon overwhelmed and annihilated. the remaining English forces began to flee in disarray toward the northern woods. Norman cavalry pursued the fleeing soldiers, though records indicate that, during the chase, some horsemen charged into a ravine, later known as the Malfosse, suffering significant casualties. Yet the outcome was already decided. As the sun set below the horizon on the 14th of October, Senlac-Hill lay strewn with thousands of corpses, marking not only the end of a battle, but the end of an era of civilization. The Battle of Hastings lasted from sunrise to sunset, an exceptionally rare duration for a medieval conflict. Most medieval battles were decided within an hour or two, yet Hastings endured for nearly 8 to 9 hours. This alone speaks to the high morale and tenacious combat effectiveness of both armies, particularly the English side. Harold's forces having fought at Stamford Bridge and endured a grueling 600-kilometer forced march, still managed to withstand a full day of fierce assaults at Senlac-Hill. Had he been given more time to muster his troops, or had his elite forces not been depleted at Stamford Bridge, the outcome of the battle could very well have been different. The course of history sometimes hinges on a matter of weeks, and Harold, unfortunately, did not have those weeks. William won. However, his victory was not overwhelming, but rather a narrow, hard-fought turnaround. Looking back at the entire battle, there were at least 3 moments when he teetered on the brink of defeat. The panic that swept through his army when the Bretons broke and fled. The collapse of morale when rumors spread of the Duke's death, and the seemingly impenetrable shield wall that held for most of the day. Had any one of these crises not been averted, if William had not removed his helmet to rally his troops during the rout, if the feigned retreat tactic had failed, or if Harold had not fallen in the evening, the story we tell today would be entirely different. Hastings was not a foregone conclusion, but a perilous reversal of fortune, achieved only through the convergence of multiple chance factors. For Harold, Hastings was a tragedy of time and attrition. He fought 2 major battles within 3 weeks, marching over 600 kilometers, a test of human endurance and organizational capacity that would push the limits in any era. Had he been given 2 to 3 weeks to rest and regroup after Stamford Bridge, or if he had waited for reinforcements from the northern earls before heading south for the decisive battle, the outcome might have been very different. But he chose speed, just as he had when marching north to confront the Vikings. Speed had granted him victory at Stamford Bridge, yet the same strategy cost him everything at Hastings. A single weapon cannot remain effective forever, and at the most critical moment, Harold failed to change his approach. For William, Hastings was the ultimate test of all the qualities he possessed in life. Calm strategic judgment, choosing to establish a defensive position on the coast, forcing Harold to attack him rather than venturing inland. Extreme personal courage, removing his helmet amidst the retreat to steady the troops on the front lines. Tactical flexibility, swiftly shifting to a feigned retreat strategy after all frontal assaults were thwarted. Unyielding willpower, never giving up despite seeing no clear progress for 8 or 9 hours. And that belief, etched into his bones since childhood, never bowing to fate. The boy from Normandy, who had once been carried to safety in the darkness, today used everything he had learned to win a kingdom. The battlefield after the battle was a living hell, according to later records. Corpses piled up in certain areas to the point where it was difficult to walk. William ordered the construction of a monastery on the battlefield, later known as Battle Abbey, and it is said that the altar was placed exactly where Harold fell. This was a typical medieval act of atonement, using a monastery to seek God's forgiveness for the slaughter of the battlefield. It was also a declaration of power on the spot where your king fell. I built my church to seek forgiveness through destruction and to inscribe victory in stone. This was the conqueror's standard way of reconciling conscience and power. The ruins of Battle Abbey still stand on that hill today, silently bearing witness to the afternoon that changed everything. The Battle of Hastings holds a unique place in military history. It is not famous for tactical innovation. Shield wall defenses and cavalry charges were already well-established tactics of the time. Its uniqueness lies in its consequences. Few single battles have so thoroughly altered the fate of a nation. Waterloo ended Napoleon, but did not change France's language or legal system. Stalingrad turned the tide of World War II, but did not reshape Russia's social structure. Hastings achieved all of this. It transformed England's ruling class, land system, legal framework, architectural style, and even the language itself. The aftermath of a battle that ended in a single day has lasted 1,000 years and continues to resonate. But we must remind ourselves, Hastings was only the beginning of the conquest, not its end. William won a battle on the 14th of October, but he had not yet won a kingdom. Harold was dead, but England did not automatically submit to Normandy. The nobles in London hastily elected a new king after the battle, Edgar Fethling, the great-nephew of Edward the Confessor. Though this young king had no real military power to support his title. Vast regions in the north and west of England remained under the control of Anglo-Saxon nobles. Whether victory in a single battle could translate into lasting rule over the entire kingdom. The answer to that question was far from clear. In the next chapter, we will follow William from the battlefield of Hastings to the throne in London. He will use a meticulously designed circuitous route to instill fear and despair into the heart of England, until the kingdom opens its gates to him in the cold winds of Christmas. But conquering England is not a matter of a single day. Between his coronation and true control lie years of rebellion, bloody suppression, and the large-scale scorched earth campaign. Later known as the Harrying of the North, the crown is within reach, but to secure it firmly on his head, William will have to pay a price he himself may not have anticipated. From conqueror on the battlefield to king on the throne, this distance, seemingly only a few dozen kilometers, will take years of bloodshed to traverse. After the Battle of Hastings, William found himself in a seemingly contradictory situation. He had won a decisive victory on the battlefield, but was still far from truly ruling England. Harold was dead, and England's most elite military forces had been destroyed on Senlac Hill. Yet, the kingdom did not surrender automatically. The nobles in London hastily proclaimed the young Edgar as the new king, while the earls in the north and west still held their own armies. William had only a battle-weary army and a small foothold on the southern coast. The distance from Hastings to London was just over 100 kilometers. But to complete this journey, he needed not only military strength, but also political wisdom. William's actions after Hastings were a masterclass in the psychology of conquest. He did not march directly on London. A foreign invader who had just killed the English king on the battlefield would only provoke desperate resistance from the entire city if he advanced straight to its gates. Instead, he chose a carefully calculated, circuitous route. He first moved east to Dover, the fortress town commanding the narrowest point of the English Channel. After a brief resistance, Dover surrendered, allowing William to secure his channel passage back to Normandy. This was no small matter. An invading army with no way out, and one with a secure line of retreat, are psychologically worlds apart. Ensuring a line of retreat is the first iron rule of any expedition. From Dover, William continued his advance inland, but he did not take the shortest straight route to London. Instead, he followed a wide, sweeping arc, moving slowly through the countryside of southern and western England. He systematically burned villages, destroyed farmlands, and severed London's connections with the outside world. Militarily, This tactic is known as ravaging, undermining the enemy's will to resist by devastating their economic foundation on a large scale. Yet, William's ravaging was not blind violence. It had precise political objectives. He aimed to make the nobles in London see clearly. For every additional day of resistance, another swath of their kingdom would be reduced to ashes. The price of surrender was dignity, but the price of resistance was everything. Meanwhile, William was skillfully dividing the English resistance. He sent envoys to engage with different English nobles individually, delivering tailored messages to each. Those who surrendered would retain their lands and status, while those who resisted would lose everything. This strategy of division sowed mutual suspicion within the rebel alliance. Each noble feared that others might strike private deals with William first, leaving them as the last to be targeted. Unity is most fragile when facing an opponent who knows how to divide. William did not need to defeat everyone. He only needed to convince enough people that resistance was hopeless. The rest would crumble in isolation. The final leg of the detour saw William crossing the Thames, not at London, but upstream at Wallingford. This choice once again demonstrated strategic foresight. Approaching from the west meant severing London's connections with the west of England. London was now surrounded on three sides. By the surrendered Kent to the east, the ravaged Sussex to the south, and William's main force to the west. Only the north maintained a tenuous link to the outside world. More critically, at Wallingford, Stigand, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and one of England's most important church leaders surrendered to William. When the highest authority of the church had abandoned resistance, how long could the will of the secular nobility hold out? The noose was tightening, and despair spread through the city of London. The atmosphere in London shifted from anger to despair. The young King Edgar Fethling possessed neither military strength nor ruling experience. His throne was essentially a symbolic gesture born of desperation. The northern earls Edwin and Morcar, though they had troops at their disposal, had been hesitant since Hastings. Their interest in protecting their northern territories far outweighed any desire to shed blood for a boy king. When William's army appeared at Berkhamsted, northwest of London, the nobles finally made their choice. Edgar Fethling, along with London's leading nobles and church leaders, left the city to surrender to William, acknowledging him as the rightful king of England. A city that had never been conquered completed its surrender by opening its gates. On Christmas Day, the 25th of December 1066, William was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey in London. This was the third coronation in the same church in less than a year. The ceremony, conducted according to Anglo-Saxon tradition, was presided over by Archbishop Ealdred of York. William deliberately chose a native English church leader to enhance his legitimacy. However, an ominous incident occurred during the ceremony. When the crowd inside the church cheered for the new king, the Norman guards outside, mistaking the noise for a riot, set fire to nearby buildings. The nobles inside the church fled in terror, and William was said to have turned pale with anger. A sacred ceremony was turned into a farce by the panic of his own soldiers. From the very first day, the conqueror's rule was marked by misunderstanding and violence. The fire at the coronation, though quickly extinguished, served as an ominous prophecy, hinting that the conqueror's rule was marked from the very first day by misunderstanding, fear, and violence. The English nobles and clergy inside the church were startled by the blaze and scattered in panic, while William, it is said, turned pale. Not out of fear, but from anger. A sacred moment meant to showcase the new king's authority and order was ruined by the panic and violence of his own soldiers. This farce perfectly foreshadowed the reality of the years to come. The conqueror sat on the throne, but there was zero mutual trust between him and the kingdom. A crown seized by violence required even more violence to maintain. at least until the conquered learned to submit. In the initial months following his coronation, William adopted a cautious policy of conciliation. He confirmed the lands and titles of some English nobles, preserved the Anglo-Saxon administrative and legal systems, and even began learning English to demonstrate his respect for English traditions. He hoped that, through these gestures, the English would accept a simple narrative. Everything remained the same except for the change of the king at the very top. However, this conciliatory approach failed almost from the start, not because the policy itself was flawed, but because his Norman followers could not accept returning empty-handed. These men had followed William across the sea, not to allow the English to retain their lands, but to acquire lands for themselves. In 1067, during William's brief return to Normandy, the first wave of rebellions erupted across England. The city of Exeter refused to acknowledge William's authority and declared independence. William swiftly led his army back to England and laid siege to Exeter. The city surrendered after holding out for 18 days. William's handling of Exeter continued his consistent approach of precise political maneuvering. He did not massacre the city or carry out large-scale reprisals, but instead built a castle within it as a permanent symbol of power and a military control point. The message of this castle was clear: you may rebel, but the outcome of each rebellion will be the addition of another fortress belonging to me in your city. The cost of rebellion was not temporary punishment, but a permanent escalation of control. But Exeter was merely the prelude. The true crisis erupted in 1069, northern England. Yorkshire and its surrounding regions launched an unprecedented rebellion. The danger of this uprising lay not only in its scale, but also in the external support it received. King Sweyn II of Denmark dispatched a massive fleet to land in northern England and join forces with the rebels. This was no longer scattered local unrest, but a nationwide revolt with foreign military intervention. In September, the rebels captured the city of York, killing the stationed Norman garrison. For William, this was the most severe military and political crisis since Hastings. If the North succeeded in gaining independence, his kingdom would be split in two. William's response to the Great Northern Rebellion was the most controversial and terrifying action of his life. What later generations would call the Northern Harrowing. He led his army north not merely to suppress the rebellion, but to ensure that the North would never again have the capacity to rise up. From the winter of 1069 to early 1070, William's forces systematically destroyed the very foundations of life in Yorkshire and the surrounding regions. Villages were burned, fields scorched, livestock slaughtered, granaries smashed, and farming tools shattered. This was not violence on the battlefield, but a deliberate annihilation of the civilian means of survival. His aim was to create a wasteland where human life could not be sustained. No food, no shelter, no livestock. The Northern Harrowing caused massive famine and population collapse. The exact death toll varies significantly across historical records and modern studies. But all sources agree on its extreme devastation. Chroniclers of the time, including Norman authors generally sympathetic to William, expressed shock and condemnation. Orderic Vitalis wrote that it was the most unforgivable act of William's life. Vast tracts of farmland turned into wilderness for decades afterward. In the Domesday Book of 1086, numerous manors in Yorkshire were still recorded as wasteland, ironclad evidence that recovery had not occurred even 16 years after the harrowing. This debt on history's ledger can never be erased. It remains the most enduring scar left by the conqueror upon the North. We must pause our narrative here to confront the moral questions raised by the harrying of the North. This was not battlefield violence, which in any era is accepted as part of war, but the deliberate starvation and extermination of defenseless civilians, even by the moral standards of the 11th century. This went far beyond what was acceptable. What William demonstrated in the harrying of the North was not the unavoidable collateral damage of war, but a coldly calculated policy of terror, eliminating a region's capacity to resist by inflicting extreme suffering. Understanding this brutal strategic logic does not excuse it. An act can be effective and evil at the same time. The northern devastation achieved the military objectives William had anticipated. The rebellion was completely crushed, and the Danish fleet withdrew after receiving William's ransom. Thereafter, for an entire generation, the north of England never again launched large-scale resistance, not because they did not want to, but because they no longer had the capacity. A region stripped of all resources for survival could not organize effective military operations. From a purely strategic perspective, the northern devastation was a brutal yet effective eradication campaign. It exchanged a few months of extreme violence for decades of stability. But the price of this stability was a wasteland, strewn with bones and the suffering of a generation. The chasm between efficiency and morality was laid bare here in a stark and shocking manner. After the pacification of the North, the last stronghold of organized resistance in England was the Isle of Ely in the eastern marshes. A minor Anglo-Saxon noble, named Hereward, established a base of resistance amidst the swamps and reeds of Ely. Hereward's story was later romanticized in English folklore as a Robin Hood. Like legend, the last Saxon hero resisting foreign conquerors in the marshes. In reality, Hereward's military threat was quite limited, but his symbolic significance outweighed his military impact. As long as Ely remained unconquered, the conquest was not complete. In 1071, William mobilized a large army, constructed a causeway through the marshes, and finally captured the Isle of Ely. With the fall of Ely, the military conquest of England was formally completed. From October 1066 to 1071, William spent about 5 years transforming a single battle victory into actual control over the entire kingdom. This 5-year process can be summarized as a repeatedly recurring pattern. Rebellion erupts. Military suppression, construction of castles at the rebellion sites, appointment of Normans as local rulers. Each cycle deepened Norman control and weakened England's capacity for resistance. By 1071, the Anglo-Saxon nobility in England had been systematically stripped of most of their land and power. Conquest was not an instant event, but a slow and relentless process of squeezing. The network of castles constructed by William during the conquest deserves particular attention. This was not a random military construction, but a deliberate system of control. Castles were built at every strategic point: city centers, river crossings, road junctions, and coastal ports. The Tower of London is the most famous among them. It was never intended to protect the citizens of London, but to intimidate and control them. These castles were not only military strongholds, but also administrative centers and permanent physical declarations of Norman power. A stone castle could be defended by a small garrison, yet dominate the surrounding area for dozens of kilometers. William replicated the politics of castle building he had learned in Normandy on a larger, more systematic scale in England. Looking back at the entire conquest from Hastings to Ely, we can see that William demonstrated two distinct yet complementary abilities. The first was his skill as a military commander, swift to react, decisive in striking, and unwavering on the battlefield. The second was his talent as a political strategist, the psychological maneuvering around London, the diplomatic tactics to divide the English nobility, and the precise alternation between limited leniency toward those who surrendered and extreme punishment for those who resisted. Most conquerors excel in only one of these areas. Pure military geniuses often lack political finesse, while shrewd politicians often lack the courage to lead from the front lines. William possessed both, and he knew exactly when to employ each. However, the completion of the conquest also signaled the emergence of a deeper question: What comes after the conquest? Defeating an army is one thing. Governing a kingdom with millions of people and centuries of cultural tradition is entirely another. William now had to transform an Anglo-Saxon nation into a system that he and his Norman followers could rule over the long term. This required not more battles, but a comprehensive social restructuring, from land systems to legal frameworks, and even language and culture. If Hastings was the climax of the conquest, then the subsequent institutional building was its true core. For any conquest that cannot be institutionalized is merely a temporary occupation. Before we continue with the story of how William rebuilt England, let us pause and consider what the conquest brought to the ordinary people of England. For the peasants living in villages far from the battlefields, daily life may not have changed dramatically in the first few years. They still tilled the same land and paid similar taxes. What truly changed was the sky above them. A stone castle, perhaps unseen before, might have risen beside the village. The priest in the church might have been replaced by a stranger who spoke French. And the lord of the manor might have shifted from a Saxon they had known for generations to a Norman whose language they could not understand. This top-down infiltration was gradual, but irreversible. It began with the transfer of land ownership. The Normans replaced the Saxons as the masters of nearly all significant estates. Then came the church. Norman bishops and abbots supplanted their English predecessors. Next was language. French became the language of the court and law, while English was relegated to the everyday speech of the common people. Then architecture, stone castles, and Romanesque churches replaced the timber, framed Saxon structures, transforming the nation's skyline, each layer of change built upon the previous one, digging deeper. By the 1080s, England had been fundamentally altered both physically and institutionally. From the battlefield of Hastings to the marshes of Ely, from the coronation at Christmas to the devastation in the north. Chapter 5 tells the story of how a conqueror transformed the victory of a single battle into permanent control over a kingdom. This process is not a heroic epic. It is filled with cold calculation, systematic violence, and indifference to the suffering of civilians. Yet, it also demonstrates a disturbing efficiency. William accomplished in 5 years what many conquerors could not achieve in a lifetime. His secret was not a single extraordinary ability, but a comprehensive skill in weaving military strikes, political maneuvering, psychological tactics, and institutional building into a unified strategy. A crown was now firmly placed upon his head. Military conquest can be accomplished within a few years, but the conquest of civilization requires decades or even centuries. After his final battle in the Ely Marshes in 1071, William faced a task far more complex and profound than defeating enemies on the battlefield. He needed to fundamentally transform an Anglo-Saxon kingdom into a system that could ensure long-term and stable Norman rule. This was not merely a change of kings, it was a complete redesign of the social structure. The land system had to be rebuilt, feudal hierarchies reshaped, the church system reformed, administration upgraded, and even the language itself had to be replaced. The scale and thoroughness of this social engineering project William was about to undertake were almost unprecedented in medieval Europe. He aimed not only to conquer the bodies of the English, but also their institutions, spaces, and memories. The first and most fundamental step in the reconstruction was the redistribution of land. During the Anglo-Saxon era, England's land was held by thousands of local nobles and ecclesiastical institutions, resulting in a complex and fragmented ownership structure. William did something revolutionary. He declared that all land in England legally belonged to the king alone. Everyone, from the highest-ranking earls to the lowest free farmers, merely held and used the land in the king's name. This concept was absent in Anglo-Saxon tradition. William's land revolution transformed England into the European country, with the most tightly structured feudal system, while the French king was still struggling to secure recognition of royal authority from nobles outside his domain. Every inch of land in England already legally belonged to a single individual. This level of centralization was unparalleled in Europe at the time. Within this legal framework, William initiated a large-scale redistribution of land. By the time the Domesday Book was compiled in 1086, almost no significant estates in England remained in Anglo-Saxon hands. The original English nobility were systematically stripped of their lands, replaced by approximately 200 new lords of Norman and allied origins. However, William's method of allocation was exceptionally shrewd. He deliberately scattered the holdings of each major vassal across the country, rather than concentrating them in a single region. This ensured that no vassal could amass enough independent power in any one area to challenge royal authority. France's prolonged struggles between the monarchy and regional lords were precisely due to the highly concentrated territories of its nobility. From the outset, William's design of dispersed fiefdoms eliminated this possibility. The top-level design of this land system was ultimately legally confirmed in the Salisbury Oath of 1086. William summoned all significant landholders across England to gather on the Salisbury Plain, demanding that they all swear direct allegiance to the king himself. This demand was revolutionary in feudal Europe. In the typical feudal system, a lower-ranking knight owed allegiance only to his immediate lord, not to the king. However, the Salisbury Oath broke this hierarchy. Regardless of who your immediate lord was, your primary and ultimate allegiance was to the king. The significance of this principle cannot be overstated. It ensured that, even if a major noble rebelled, his subordinate vassals had both a legal obligation and a moral basis to refuse to join the rebellion and instead remain loyal to the king. If the land system was the skeleton of the conquest, then the network of castles was its muscle. William built a staggering number of castles across England during and after the conquest. By the time of his death, it is estimated that there were hundreds of Norman castles of various sizes throughout the country. These castles were not built for beauty, but for control. They were strategically placed in key locations, city centers, river crossings, road junctions, rebellious regions, and coastal ports. The earliest castles were simple wooden and earth fortifications that could be built in weeks, later upgraded to stone structures. The Tower of London is the most famous and symbolic of them all. Standing on the banks of the Thames not to defend London, but to intimidate and control its inhabitants. The psychological impact of castles on the native English population was profound. In Anglo-Saxon England, stone castles were virtually non-existent. Defense relied primarily on fortified towns with earthen walls and wooden palisades. When the Normans erected towering stone towers in urban centers, it was not just a military threat but a civilizational shock. The grey-white stone monoliths announced the conqueror's permanent presence in an unprecedented way. Wood could be burned, earthen walls could be torn down, but stone meant permanence. Opening your door each day and looking up at that cold tower made it clear the old world was gone forever. Castles were not merely military tools, but weapons of psychological conquest. Using stone to tell the conquered that their future had been irreversibly rewritten. Architecture is the most enduring language of conquest. Beyond land and castles, William also undertook a comprehensive Normanization of the English Church. He replaced nearly all native English bishops and abbots of major monasteries with churchmen brought from Normandy. The most significant appointment was that of Lanfranc, a distinguished scholar from Pavia, Italy, who later gained fame at the Abbey of Bec in Normandy as Archbishop of Canterbury, making him the highest leader of the English Church. With William's support, Lanfranc implemented profound reforms in the English Church, strengthening ecclesiastical discipline, promoting monastic reforms and unifying liturgical practices. These reforms objectively improved the administrative standards and academic quality of the English Church, but they also meant that Anglo-Saxon religious traditions and the ecclesiastical elite were thoroughly marginalized. William's most creative and astonishing institutional contribution to England was the Domesday Book, compiled between 1085 and 1086. The origin of this document was practical. William needed to know the exact value of the kingdom he had conquered to establish a fair taxation policy. However, the method he employed to achieve this goal was unprecedented at the time. He dispatched commissioners to every county in England to conduct a detailed survey, recording each manor's land area, types of cultivated land, livestock numbers, population, annual income, and changes in ownership from the time of Edward the Confessor to after the Conquest. This was the most systematic and comprehensive national asset census in medieval Europe, and the entire Christian world contemporary English chroniclers were astounded to note that not even an ox, a pig, or even a beehive escaped the king's ledger. The name Domesday Book itself is steeped in dark humor. The English called this census the Domesday Book because, like God's final judgment, it left nothing out and offered no chance for appeal. No one could hide their property or evade the king's taxes in the face of this book. Its wealth of information is so vast that modern historians continue to unearth new data about the socio-economic conditions of 11th century England from its pages. But for the people of England at the time, the Domesday Book represented a new and terrifying level of state control. The king now not only held sway over the castles above and the lands beneath their feet, but he even knew precisely how many cattle they owned, how many acres of wheat fields they cultivated, and how much tax they had paid the previous year. The impact of the Norman conquest on the English language is perhaps the most profound and enduring of all changes. Following the conquest, Norman French replaced English as the official language of the court, law, and the upper classes. Kings and nobles spoke French. Legal documents were written in French or Latin, and the ecclesiastical elite also used Latin and French English, a language that had developed over centuries with a rich literary tradition, was relegated to the everyday speech of the common people. A linguistic chasm existed between an English peasant and the Norman lord above him. This linguistic division would persist for nearly 3 centuries, with English not regaining its status as an official language until the 14th century. Yet, when English finally returned, it was no longer the same language as before the conquest. It had absorbed thousands of French words, transforming into a completely new hybrid language. The dual language system had an unexpected effect on the long-term development of English. It turned English into one of the most vocabulary-rich languages in the world. During the nearly 3 centuries of bilingual coexistence, a vast number of French words entered the English language. This fusion followed a pattern corresponding to social hierarchy. Words for everyday labor retained their Germanic roots: cow, pig, sheep, house, field, while terms related to law, politics, and religion often came from French justice, government, religion, dinner. The most classic example is that living animals are referred to with English words: cow, pig, sheep. But once served at the table, they take on French names: beef, pork, mutton. The livestock were raised by Saxon farmers, while the meat was eaten by Norman nobles. Language faithfully recorded the social structure of conquest, more honestly than any chronicle. This is also one of the deep reasons why English later became such a flexible and powerful global language. The Normans fundamentally transformed the architectural landscape of England. Beyond castles, they introduced a Romanesque style, characterized by thick stone walls, rounded arches, barrel vaults, and decorative pilasters, which quickly replaced the simpler wooden structures and early stone buildings of the Saxon era. From cathedrals to monasteries, from lordly manors to town churches, the Normans redefined England's skyline in stone. Durham Cathedral and Norwich Cathedral stand as the most spectacular examples of Norman architecture. These structures were not merely functional religious spaces, but also physical declarations of power. Their massive scale and intricate craftsmanship conveyed a clear message to all who gazed upon them. Those who built them possessed resources and strength beyond imagination. William's impact on the English legal system, though less immediate than his land reforms, was equally profound. He did not entirely abolish Anglo-Saxon legal traditions, but instead introduced Norman legal concepts and practices while preserving most local customary laws. One of the most significant changes was his formal separation of secular and ecclesiastical jurisdictions, previously intertwined in the Anglo-Saxon system. He also introduced Norman land and inheritance laws, altering the way property disputes were adjudicated. More far-reaching was the gradual fusion of these legal practices with England's native customary laws over the following centuries, which ultimately evolved into the common law system, today governing approximately 1/3 of the world's population. Let us turn our attention to the most easily overlooked group in this great upheaval. The ordinary people of England. A farmer living in Yorkshire in the 1070s faced changes. Like these, the lord of the manor shifted from a Saxon he had known for 20 years to a foreigner, speaking an incomprehensible language. Taxes might not have increased significantly, but they were now collected in a stone castle he had never seen before. The parish priest was replaced by a Norman, and the style and content of sermons changed. If he was unfortunate enough to live in the areas affected by the devastation in the north, he might have lost everything. From above, the conquest appeared as a change of systems from below. It was the shattering and reassembling of countless individual destinies. Behind every institutional transformation in history books, there are countless ordinary people, silently adapting or struggling. They have no names, but their silence forms the truest backdrop of the conquest. By the mid-1080s, roughly 2 decades after the conquest, England had been fundamentally reshaped at an institutional level. Land had shifted from Saxon to Norman hands. The church had passed from the control of native English elites to Norman churchmen. French had replaced English as the language of power. Stone castles and Romanesque churches transformed the nation's skyline. Feudalism was established more tightly than anywhere on the European continent. The Domesday Book gave the king detailed knowledge of the kingdom's assets. The Oath of Salisbury ensured the direct allegiance of all vassals to the crown. If the Battle of Hastings was the lightning strike of the conquest, these 2 decades of institution building were its roots. Lightning may be forgotten, but roots, once set, are nearly impossible to uproot. The success of this social restructuring can largely be attributed to William's unique personal quality. He was an extremely pragmatic institutional designer. He did not attempt to completely abolish Saxon traditions and build a purely Norman system from scratch, which would have faced greater resistance and wasted the well-functioning parts of the existing institutions. Instead, he retained England's county administrative system, preserved most of the common law, and maintained the basic framework of the tax mechanism. Then superimposed Norman feudal institutions, land laws, and church reforms onto this framework. This strategy of preserving the underlying operating system while replacing the upper-level applications minimized the cost of transformation. The best institutional reforms are not about tearing everything down and starting over, but about grafting, cultivating new branches on old roots, allowing both to form a stronger whole than they could have achieved separately. The system established by William in England showed clear continuity with his model of rule in Normandy. Yet, there were also significant differences. In Normandy, he spent 15 years gradually building his personal authority from a bastard boy. In England, He held absolute power from day one as a conqueror. The institutions of Normandy evolved gradually through long-term negotiation, while those of England were imposed from above in a short period. This difference explains why the feudal system in England was more tightly structured than in Normandy. It was a one-time design rather than the product of gradual compromise. Even the most sophisticated institutional design cannot eliminate the fundamental contradiction of conquest. The rule of a minority of outsiders over a majority of locals. The proportion of Normans in England was extremely small. Scholars estimate that the number of Normans and their allies who settled in England did not exceed 20,000, while the total population of England was likely between 1.5 and 2 million. Each Norman ruled over approximately 100 English people. This extreme ratio meant that governance always relied on two pillars: the military advantage of castles and the administrative efficiency of institutions. If either of these pillars faltered, the entire system faced collapse. This explains why William invested such immense effort in castles and institutions. He was not pursuing perfection, but ensuring survival. The pressure of survival is the best institutional designer. The rule of a minority over a majority is a perpetual war that can never be relaxed. Chapter 6 recounts a silent revolution, devoid of dramatic battles like Hastings or the terrifying violence of the Northern harrowing. Yet its impact was far more profound and enduring than any single conflict. William established an economic foundation through land redistribution, a political framework through feudalism, military control via a network of castles, an ideological structure through church reforms, and an information advantage with the Domesday Book. These 5 pillars together supported an unprecedented, centralized, and efficient system of governance. However, this system ultimately rested on the will and capability of one man. Could it endure once he was gone? The deepening rifts between him, his wife, and his sons were beginning to offer a troubling hint. Conquest is not the end, but the beginning. At the coronation ceremony on Christmas Day in 1066, Norman soldiers outside Westminster Abbey, misunderstanding the cheers, set fire to nearby houses. Amid the chaos, William was hastily crowned, his hands trembling. This unexpected scene inadvertently revealed the essential dilemma of conquest. A brilliant military victory does not automatically translate into a stable ruling order. He held a crown in his hands, but beneath his feet lay unfamiliar land, a group of discontented Anglo-Saxon nobles, and a nation that could ignite in rebellion at any moment. The real war had only just begun. Defeating Harold took only a day, but making England submit forever would require the remaining 21 years of his life. His answer was one of the most sophisticated feudal ruling machines in human history, using land, oaths, castles, and written records to lock the fruits of conquest into the chains of a system, leaving no room for any force attempting to break free. William's first move was to redefine the meaning of land, fundamentally overturning England's property order from its roots. In the Anglo-Saxon tradition, land was a form of private property that could be accumulated, bought, sold, gifted, and passed down through generations, with ownership dispersed among nobles and freeholders of various classes. The king was merely the most powerful among many landholders. William severed this logic with a single stroke. He declared that all land in England ultimately belonged to the king. Anyone holding land was merely leasing it from the king, on the condition of providing military service, paying taxes, and swearing allegiance. Without the king's authorization, no one inherently owned any piece of land. This was not a policy adjustment. It was a complete, silent revolution in property rights. The wealth and power base, once scattered among hundreds of families, were now consolidated under the king's name through a single logical proposition, with William as its sole representative. Overnight, the entire English nobility transformed from landowners into tenants of the land. Yet, William did not trust any single Norman noble, not even his most loyal comrades in arms. He had witnessed too many lessons from Normandy. Overly powerful vassals would inevitably become the next rebels, and his own childhood had been spent in the shadow of such fears. Thus, he adopted a deliberately fragmented land grant strategy, dividing English territory into hundreds of parcels and distributing them among different lords, with these holdings intentionally scattered geographically. A single lord's estates were often spread across 3 or even 4 non-adjacent counties. You might have a manor in Kent, another in York, and yet another in Devon. But these 3 lands were isolated from one another, never forming a contiguous domain capable of independent operation. Anyone attempting to gather troops for rebellion would first have to contend with the lengthy logistical chain of cross-county mobilization, a process during which the king's spies would already have sounded the alarm. Fragmentation was not chaos, but a meticulously designed method of control, ensuring each vassal was wealthy enough, yet never powerful enough to challenge the crown alone. Every piece William placed on the chessboard was intended to make the board itself unbreakable. The Salisbury Oath of 1086 pushed this system to its logical extreme and became the clearest footnote to William's art of governance. William summoned all free landholders in England, not only the primary vassals who received land directly from him, but also the vassals of vassals and the sub-vassals of lords, as long as they held land, to personally appear on the Salisbury Plain and swear allegiance to the king in his presence. This was a groundbreaking political declaration and a blatant departure from feudal conventions on the European continent. In France, or the Holy Roman Empire, a vassal's vassal was only responsible to their immediate lord. But William declared that in England, the ultimate endpoint of all allegiance was always the king himself, regardless of how many layers of lords stood in between. Every landholder was the king's man, and every feudal relationship paled into insignificance before royal authority. This principle fundamentally severed the possibility of major vassals rallying their subordinates against the crown, and profoundly shaped the political DNA of English monarchy for centuries to come, becoming one of the core features that distinguished England from continental feudal systems. The knightly class was the core gear of this machine, and the knight service system was the mainspring that drove the gears to turn. William exchanged land for military service, requiring each lord, based on the size and value of their holdings, to pledge a fixed number of fully armed knights, equipped with their own horses, weapons, and supplies, for service to the king when needed, typically for 40 days each year. This system transformed the entire nobility into a military reserve force that required no daily upkeep and could be mobilized at any time. There was no need for the high costs of mercenaries or the financial burden of maintaining a standing army. With just a land deed, the war machine was wound up and ready, awaiting the king's command. William's genius lay in making the knights sustain themselves, using the income from their lands to maintain their combat readiness, while simultaneously binding this force firmly to the royal authority through oaths of allegiance. This single system solved 3 challenges at once: finance, military, and political control, representing the pinnacle of medieval administrative wisdom. Yet, knights operate on loyalty. Loyalty is sustained by interests, and interests are ultimately secured by deterrence. William understood the fragility of this chain of logic. Loyalty is cheap in times of prosperity and costly in crises. Oaths and land interests alone were insufficient to keep a nobility ever prone to ambition in line. Thus, castles became his most crucial political tool, not merely military fortifications, but the physical embodiment of his will to rule. Each castle that rose from the ground sent the same message to the English people within dozens of miles. This land has changed hands, and its new master has the power to make any resistance unbearably costly. The stone walls of the castles were not just defenses, but psychological barriers. They ensured that resistance was defeated in people's minds long before it could become action. With stone, William wrote his clearest political declaration: "I have come, I have stayed, and I will not leave." The construction speed of Norman castles was astonishing. Within 2 decades after the conquest, over 500 castles rose across the English landscape, from the cliffs of Dover's coast to the plains of York, from the border fortresses of Chester to the banks of the Thames at the Tower of London. Nearly every strategic stronghold was occupied by stone and timber. These castles were not isolated military outposts, but formed a nationwide network of control, within a day's ride of each other. They allowed for swift intelligence transmission and timely reinforcement assembly. Castles also served as administrative centers, tax collection points, and judicial venues. Lords collected rents, settled disputes, mustered militias, and stored grain within their walls. From their high towers, Norman lords overlooked the surrounding villages and fields, making the geography of power vividly clear and inescapable. Before the Norman conquest, England had almost no stone castles of this kind. After the conquest, they permanently altered England's skyline and transformed the way power manifested across the land. The knights and castles addressed the issue of military control, but William faced a deeper administrative challenge. What exactly did he possess? In an era without modern household registration or land records, owning England was a dizzyingly vague concept. The newly elevated Norman nobles urgently needed to know the precise boundaries of their fiefs, their potential yields, and the obligations attached to them. The native English needed to understand the limits of their new master's demands and how much of their old rights remained. The royal court needed to ascertain the true value of the conquest, and which vassals had underreported the services they owed. After 2 decades of entrenchment in the land, William still could not answer the most fundamental question with precision. What were the actual assets of my kingdom? In the winter of 1085, he summoned his advisors to Gloucester and made an unprecedented decision. He would conduct a comprehensive survey of the kingdom, transforming every inch of land and every head of livestock from ambiguity into numbers, from oral tradition into written record. What he needed was not merely numbers, but an unassailable map of power. In the spring of 1086, William's royal commissioners, divided into groups and accompanied by assistants and oaths, traveled through every shire, hundred, and village in England. Their method of inquiry was through public hearings, summoning the sheriff, representatives of the bishop, local knights, and ordinary villagers. They interrogated them one by one with a set of standard questions. Who owns the land? Who owned it before the conquest? How many plowed fields, meadows, woodlands, mills, and fish ponds are there? How many freemen, villeins, and boarders live there? How many oxen, pigs, and sheep are there? What was the value of the land before the conquest? And what is it worth now? The commissioners required the locals to swear an oath to ensure the truthfulness of their statements, with any false reporting or omissions risking severe punishment. The scale and systematic nature of this comprehensive survey were unparalleled in the history of medieval Europe. Chroniclers later recorded that the public's shock at this survey felt like the arrival of God's final judgment. Not even a single ox could escape his eyes. The Domesday Book was ultimately compiled into 2 large finely bound volumes, detailing the property information of approximately 13,000 villages. Its name stems from the fear and awe it inspired among ordinary English people. Much like God's final reckoning of every soul on Judgment Day, where no one can escape scrutiny, this royal document meticulously accounted for every inch of land, every head of livestock, and every serf, leaving no corner untouched and showing no mercy. The power of this document extended far beyond its function as a tax record. It proclaimed to every person in England that the king knew what they owned, what they owed, what they reported, and what they concealed. Transparency became a weapon of power, more intangible and harder to resist than the sword. In the face of the Domesday Book, ambiguity became a thing of the past, and lies lost their foothold. For the first time, the wealth map of the entire society was held in the king's hands in written form. The surveyor's inquiries allowed for no exceptions or exemptions. Even a single plough ox in the most remote valley could not escape this unprecedented royal census. The true revolutionary nature of the Domesday Book lies not in what it recorded, but in what it rendered unchangeable. Prior to this, disputes over land ownership in England were often resolved based on the memories and oral traditions of local witnesses, with the reliability of witnesses and the prestige of families often determining the outcome of litigation. The Domesday Book fundamentally altered this landscape. From 1086 onward, the ultimate standard for adjudicating land ownership and tax obligations was no longer the memory of an elder, but the black and white text of royal documents. The disappearance of ambiguity meant a drastic reduction in room for manipulation. The codification of rights meant the stabilization of rights. For those who followed the rules, this was a safeguard. For those who sought to exploit loopholes, it was a shackle. Through this document, William transformed the wealth structure of all England into a precisely comparable numerical archive, shifting governance from an art reliant on interpersonal relationships to a technology dependent on written systems. This step quietly crossed the threshold into the modern administrative state. The Church was another bastion of power that William could not and would not circumvent. Before the Conquest, the English Church maintained a high degree of local independence. Many bishops and abbots were of Anglo-Saxon noble descent, and the Church's lands, revenues, and appointments largely operated beyond royal control. William transformed this through a quiet yet thorough personnel revolution. As the old bishops and abbots passed away, he systematically replaced them with Normans or continental clergy. By the time of his death in 1087, nearly all bishoprics in England were held by Normans, and Anglo-Saxon clergy were completely marginalized, removed from the centers of power, the Church. Once a potential independent force, was reshaped into an indispensable spiritual and administrative pillar of William's rule. It conveyed royal will, legitimized the order of conquest, and extended the reach of the crown into every village on every Sunday morning through its parish network. William's most crucial ally in the ecclesiastical sphere was Archbishop Lanfranc of Canterbury, a theologian from Pavia, Italy, who was tasked with transforming the English Church into the spiritual pillar of the Norman Conquest order. Lanfranc rigorously enforced continental reform standards. He strengthened clerical celibacy, disciplined monastic life, standardized liturgical practices, and scrutinized what he deemed superstitious local English saint veneration, removing unqualified figures from the liturgical calendar. To him, this was purification. To many devout English believers, it was a desecration and purge of ancestral faith. Regardless, Lanfranc's reforms aligned perfectly with William's political will. A purified, continentalized, and royally obedient English Church served as the most powerful divine endorsement for Norman rule. The alliance between William and Lanfranc turned the church pulpit into another front of the Norman conquest. Language became the most profound and silent battlefield of this new order. Its smoke not fully clearing until 3 centuries later, yet its traces were permanently etched into the very bones of English. William's court used Norman French for daily communication. Legal proceedings and royal documents were written in Latin, while Anglo-Saxon, that is, Old English, became the exclusive dialect of common farmers, artisans, and lower clergy, excluded from all formal arenas of power. 3 languages coexisted on the same soil, precisely mirroring the hierarchical structure of authority. The language you spoke largely determined who you were, what circles you could enter, and how much weight your words carried. Approximately 1/3 of modern English vocabulary derives from French loanwords, and the source of this linguistic river traces back precisely to the Norman nobles who spoke French in William's court after 1066, and the positions of power they imposed upon English society. This linguistic stratification has left behind one of the most peculiar dual-track phenomena in English vocabulary. English peasants toiling in the fields raised cows, pigs, and sheep. Old English words steeped in soil and sweat, bearing the daily hardships of laborers. Yet, when these animals were slaughtered, cooked, and served on the tables of the nobility, they became beef, pork, and mutton. Elegant terms borrowed from French, redolent of banquet halls. The living animals belonged to the English-speaking poor, while the delicacies, made from their remains, belonged to the French-speaking elite. The dual identity of these words conceals the traumatic memory of an entire civilization. This dual-track vocabulary phenomenon has made English one of the world's most lexically rich languages, as it simultaneously inherits 2 complete linguistic systems, 2 modes of thinking, and 2 distinct historical narratives, all tracing back to the Norman fleet that crossed the English Channel. William never attempted to completely eradicate England's native traditions. As a goal-oriented and pragmatic ruler, he maintained a considerable degree of tolerance toward local customs that did not threaten his political authority. Old English administrative documents continued to be used in the early years after the Conquest. Some Anglo-Saxon legal practices were preserved and incorporated into the new judicial framework, and local manorial customs and agricultural systems largely remained intact despite changes in lordship. What William needed was not a wasteland, but a functioning machine. He merely replaced the driver in the cockpit with Normans, rather than dismantling and rebuilding the entire vehicle. This pragmatic grafting strategy saved significant ruling costs at the time, and inadvertently sowed the seeds for the resilience and capacity for integration of English culture in the future. The collision of 2 civilizations ultimately did not produce a simple victor and vanquished, but gave rise to a hybrid civilization more vibrant than either could have been alone. In the later years of William's reign, this intricate machine began to show signs of internal tension. As the Norman nobles became more deeply rooted in England and amassed greater wealth, their dependence on the king gradually waned, and they began to harbor their own political ambitions. What broke William's heart even more was the betrayal from his own flesh and blood. His eldest son, Robert, deeply resented his father's reluctance to relinquish real power as the Duke of Normandy, ultimately leading to an open rebellion in 1079. Robert allied with King Philip I of France as his backer and confronted his father's forces head on. In the Battle of Gerberoi, father and son clashed in a fierce, bloody conflict, during which William was reportedly nearly unhorsed by Robert in the chaos, saved only by the intervention of English knights. Often, the hardest conquest for a conqueror is the one against those closest to him. A kingdom forged by iron will and a meticulous system had already begun to test the limits of its cohesion, while its founder was still alive. Even so, the governance framework left by William demonstrated a remarkable institutional durability, outlasting both his own life and the capabilities of his immediate successors. The logical skeleton of the feudal land system formed the fundamental organizational principle of English society for centuries to come. The principle of ultimate allegiance to the king, established by the Salisbury Oath, laid the legal groundwork for the rise of centralization under the Tudor dynasty. The tradition of royal administrative surveys, exemplified by the Domesday Book, became a vital component of England's administrative culture, the abolition and transformation of knight service were not fully realized until the 13th century, with its traces lingering even longer in English land law. William was not merely a conqueror, he was an architect who transformed force into order through institutions. What he built was not a temporary encampment that would collapse in the next battle, but a meticulously designed institutional edifice, one far more impregnable and enduring than any Norman castle. In 1087, William was severely injured after falling from his horse during a military campaign in the Vexin region of France and was taken to the Abbey of Saint Gervais, near Rouen, to recuperate. As he approached the end of his life, only a few remained by his side. His sons were busy fighting over their inheritance, while the vassals, who had once sworn blood oaths, were quietly assessing their interests under the new circumstances. The machine he had built with a lifetime of effort would continue to operate after his death. But it no longer belonged to him alone. The England that had been thoroughly reshaped, its land relations, linguistic landscape, church structure, and administrative traditions, all bearing the profound imprint of the Norman Conquest, was both his greatest legacy and a historical entity that transcended his personal will. The fierce collision of two civilizations had already taken place, and a long process of integration was quietly beginning, the fruits of which would take centuries to fully comprehend. Great conquerors in history often lose their human faces beneath the halo of victory. They become statues, monuments, bolded words in textbooks, stripped of breadth, contradictions, and those vulnerable moments that made them truly human. William, I nearly suffered the same fate. The epithet, the conqueror, encased him like a heavy suit of armor, sealing him off completely. Yet beneath that armor was a man of humble origins, a bastard who forged himself in the harshest of circumstances. A ruler of two kingdoms who still could not command obedience from his most beloved son. To truly understand William, one must pierce through that armor, to see how he treated his wife, how he grappled with his identity, how he experienced the deepest solitude at the pinnacle of power, and what kind of man he was in those neglected final moments of his life. History bestowed upon him the title of conqueror, but his true nature was far more complex, darker, and more human than that name suggests. William's character was forged in the crucible of extreme childhood pressure. Born around 1027 or 1028 in Falaise, Normandy, his mother Arlette was said to be the daughter of a tanner, and his father was Robert, I Duke of Normandy. The status of bastard was not an automatic political death sentence in 11th century Norman aristocratic society, but it was a permanent stain, a weapon that nobles could wield whenever needed. William lost his father at the age of 8, and in the following years, lost 3 guardians in succession. 2 were assassinated, and 1 was poisoned in his sleep. His childhood was spent under the shadow of assassins. It is said that one night, a servant dragged him from his bed, and they hid in peasant huts to evade an assassination attempt. Growing up in such an environment, one is either crushed or forged into a weapon. William chose the latter, but this forging came at a cost. Extreme early threats often shape extreme control, extreme vigilance, and an extreme reluctance to trust. He learned to rely on no one, for anyone could be the next betrayer. William's appearance and physique are clearly outlined in contemporary records. He was tall and robust, with astonishing strength, reputedly one of the few knights of his time capable of drawing a bowstring while galloping on horseback. His voice was loud and powerful, carrying considerable distances even amidst the chaos of the battlefield. In his later years, he became extremely obese, with such a massive abdomen that King Philippi of France publicly mocked him as big-bellied, like a pregnant woman about to give birth. A joke that came at a devastating cost, as William's retaliatory military campaigns subsequently razed several French towns to the ground. In medieval political culture, a ruler's physical image was part of the legitimacy of their authority. William chose to shape his body as a vessel of strength and will, rather than a showcase of aristocratic elegance. He spoke through force, dominated with his physique, and conveyed a message with his very flesh. This was a man you could not easily ignore. In medieval politics, the body served as a symbolic system. A king's vigor and might were not merely personal traits, but material guarantees of divine authority. A weak body could silently breed doubts about the divine mandate of kingship. William maintained a keen awareness of this symbolic logic throughout his life. Even as his physique changed in his later years, he insisted on riding into battle, refusing to let physical decline become a signal of wavering authority. The marriage between William and Matilda was the most complex relationship in his life, and one of the few narratives in medieval historical records that reveals the conqueror's tender side. Matilda, the daughter of Baldwin V, Count of Flanders, was of noble lineage, and though recorded as petite in stature, possessed a formidable will. William's pursuit of her was filled with drama. One version of the story claims she initially refused to marry a bastard, after which William found her, publicly pinned her down, beat her, and stormed off, only for Matilda to later declare she would marry no one else. Whether this story is true or not, it reflects the specific narrative logic of violence and will in the Middle Ages. Over the 30 years of their marriage, this political union evolved into a genuine partnership. While William was away on campaigns, Matilda repeatedly served as regent of Normandy, demonstrating administrative skills on par with his own. William's trust in her surpassed what he granted any of his male vassals, a rarity in an era when women were often treated as political bargaining chips. Matilda passed away in Rouen in 1083, just 4 years before William's own death. Historical records offer intriguing accounts of William's state after her demise. He was said to have grown more irritable and prone to anger, increasingly indulging in hunting, and at times revealing an unconcealable sense of desolation. Medieval chroniclers were typically reserved in depicting the emotions of rulers, so accounts that pierced through this restraint often indicated genuine feelings too intense to suppress. After her death, William made substantial donations to the church, praying for her soul, a common practice of the time, yet also possibly a religious expression of true grief. A man accustomed to controlling everything often struggles more than ordinary people to manage the inner turmoil brought by uncontrollable death. Matilda's disappearance took from him the only person who had truly stood as his equal in life, leaving a void that power could never fill. The relationship between William and his son Robert is the most tragic thread in the entire family narrative. Robert, nicknamed Short Legs, was the eldest son of William and Matilda, and according to feudal inheritance customs, should have gradually taken over the daily governance of Normandy upon reaching adulthood. However, William refused to relinquish any substantive power. He was willing to grant Robert titles, but not decision-making authority. The tension between father and son completely ruptured around 1077. Robert's younger brothers publicly mocked him, splashing him with dirty water, and William not only failed to punish them but instead ridiculed Robert's anger. A grown duke in waiting, humiliated like a child in his father's court, this deliberate or indifferently condoned degradation ultimately drove Robert to rebellion. In 1077, Robert fled Normandy with his followers, and under the protection of the King of France, began openly opposing his father. The private rift between father and son escalated into armed conflict. The stronger the father, the harder it is for the son to grow. This dilemma is not confined to any particular era. Yet, it manifested in the most extreme way within William's family. The Battle of Gerberoy in 1079 was the most dramatic physical manifestation of the rift within the William family. Robert led the rebel forces in a direct confrontation with his father's army outside the castle. During the chaos of battle, William was unhorsed and reportedly wounded by Robert himself, or one of his knights, narrowly escaping thanks to the timely rescue by English knights. The father and son eventually reached a reconciliation through Matilda's difficult mediation, with William formally recognizing Robert as the heir to Normandy. However, the true rift between them never healed. On his deathbed, William bequeathed Normandy, not England, to Robert. The English crown went to his second son, William, while the youngest son, Henry, received only a sum of money, with no land or titles. Historians continue to debate whether this final distribution was a sober political judgment or an emotional punishment for his eldest son. In his final moments, a father used his will to speak the words he had never said to his son face to face while alive. William's religious piety is an unavoidable dimension in understanding his overall character. Despite the immense tension between this devotion and his political ruthlessness, a tension he never seemed to feel needed resolution. On the eve of the Battle of Hastings, he vowed to God that he would build an abbey in gratitude, if victorious, leading to the construction of Battle Abbey on the very battlefield, with its high altar set to mark the spot where Harold fell. He strictly adhered to religious rituals, habitually consulted clergy before major decisions, and skillfully employed the church's blessings as a tool for public opinion when political legitimacy was required. His astonishingly generous donations to the church, Battle Abbey, the Abbey of Saint Fétien, and the Abbey of Sainte Trinit Feinca stand as material proof of his faith and his ongoing effort to seek redemption before God for the violence of the Conquest. Yet, all this coexisted seamlessly with his massacre of northern England and brutal punishment of rebellious nobles. In the 11th century Christian political culture, piety and violence were two distinct languages, each with its own logic, existing simultaneously within the same individual and serving different occasions and needs. William was simply more adept than most at mastering the art of switching between these two languages. William's treatment of political opponents reveals the most complex aspect of his character, one that defies simple judgment by later generations. He was neither a bloodthirsty tyrant nor a merciful benevolent ruler. He was a precise calculator of power, meting out rewards and punishments based solely on political utility rather than morality or emotion. He generally preferred imprisoning rather than executing opponents of genuine value. Morcar, Harold's brother, was held captive for years, and Bishop Odo, a Norman noble, was imprisoned for rebellion until shortly before William's death. However, when he deemed a threat beyond the control of imprisonment, his punishment was swift and unflinching. The large-scale massacres during the harrying of the North and the systematic burning of rebellious estates revealed another facet of his character, one he never concealed. This duality was not hypocrisy, but a highly rational philosophy of governance. Keep the useful alive and ensure the threatening never rise again. Only utility and consequences entered his calculations. Sentiment and morality had no place. The coldness of this governing philosophy was particularly evident in his handling of Bishop Odo. Odo was his half-brother and had played a crucial role in the conquest of England. But when Odo began independently amassing political capital and attempted to campaign for the papacy with a private army, William arrested and imprisoned him without hesitation. Blood ties were no guarantee of immunity. Only sustained political utility mattered. William's obsession with hunting was one of the most difficult aspects of his character to explain through political logic, making it all the more genuine. His passion for hunting reached a level that contemporaries considered excessive. He designated vast royal hunting grounds across England, with the New Forest being the most famous among them, to protect the deer within these grounds. Any commoner caught hunting or trespassing could face severe punishments, including blinding or castration. Chroniclers recorded this with clear criticism, noting that he loved deer as if they were his own children, showing little regard for the suffering inflicted upon the people. The establishment of royal hunting grounds even required the relocation of numerous villages, forcibly displacing populations that had lived there for decades. In a life where power demanded constant vigilance and calculation, hunting offered a rare sense of directness. Prey was prey, pursuit was pursuit, with no need for diplomatic language or institutional design. Only speed, strength, and instinct. The physical changes in William's later years became the most brutal metaphor for his relationship with power. Once renowned for his horsemanship and strength, he grew increasingly obese after the age of 50, with his expanding belly making it more difficult for him to ride. In 1087, while attacking the French city of Mantes, his warhorse stumbled into the burning ruins, causing his abdomen to crash against the front of the saddle and inflicting severe internal injuries. A man who had conquered England was betrayed by his own body and fell in a relatively minor border conflict. Even more ironically, after being gravely wounded, he was taken to a monastery near Rouen to recuperate. In the weeks before his death, his sons had already left him to return to their respective domains and prepare for the struggle for power, while his attendants began looting the furnishings and valuables even before he had drawn his last breath. The conqueror lay there, with nothing in the face of his own death. The ultimate accumulation of power still amounted to zero in the presence of death. There was no literary embellishment in this scene, nor any heroic farewell. Only an old man betrayed by his own body, abandoned by his sons, and looted by his attendants, quietly ending his stormy life on an unfamiliar monastery bed. William's final confession was recorded by several chroniclers with unusual detail. On his deathbed, he made a lengthy confession of the crimes he had committed in his lifetime, the heaviest part of which concerned the harrying of the North. William of Malmesbury recorded the profound repentance he expressed in his final moments, describing his tone as that of a man truly weighed down by conscience, rather than a performer going through the motions of a religious ritual. We cannot verify the accuracy of these records. Medieval deathbed narratives followed established literary conventions, but the consistency in the direction of multiple sources suggests some genuine psychological state behind them. A man accustomed to suppressing everything with his will, faced with inescapable death, may have been allowed for the first time to truly feel the weight of what he had done. The final vulnerability of the powerful is often their only moment of genuine self-confrontation. The identity anxiety that William experienced, which permeated his entire life, is an unavoidable theme in any discussion of his character. The term bastard was always a ready weapon in the hands of his political enemies, pointing not only to the legal issue of his birth, but also to the core anxiety within the medieval aristocratic system regarding the purity of bloodline and the legitimacy of divine mandate. William spent his life answering this challenge through his actions, conquest, legislation, construction, and devotion to the church, constantly asserting that his legitimacy lay not in his birth but in his achievements. Yet, this answer had to be written and rewritten, for the challenge never truly disappeared. His almost obsessive pursuit of legitimacy explains why he went to great lengths to secure the papal banner before setting out to conquer England. He needed God on his side because his bloodline alone was insufficient. A man of humble origins must work harder than anyone else to prove he belongs in the position he occupies. This inner drive was both his greatest source of strength and the spiritual shackle that left him with no peace. William's intellectual side is often overshadowed by his military achievements, but existing historical records indicate that he possessed a remarkably clear strategic mind and political judgment. He did not know Latin, which was not uncommon among monarchs of his time. But it is said that in his later years, he attempted to teach himself the language in order to read administrative documents directly without relying on translators. A ruler of an empire, over 50 years old, willing to learn a language personally to reduce information loss in communication, which in itself demonstrates his profound understanding of the mechanisms of power. His decision-making habit was to seek opinions widely and then make the final call himself. He was neither a symbolic monarch manipulated by advisors, nor a tyrant who stubbornly ignored counsel. He had the ability to distinguish between the acceptable and unacceptable parts of others' opinions, leaving the ultimate judgment to himself. This comprehensive ability was precisely the core weapon that enabled him to survive and ultimately triumph in the most chaotic political environments. William's relationship with the English people was the most outward projection of his identity dilemma. He was the King of England, yet he never truly became an Englishman, nor did he ever genuinely attempt to do so. He rarely learned English and maintained a ruler's detachment from England's native culture. He governed it, but did not identify with it. He needed it, but felt no attachment to it. His spiritual home was always Normandy, where he built palaces, where he and Matilda were laid to rest, and where he laid the earliest foundations of his life. For him, England was an achievement, a crown, an inheritance, not a home. This emotional detachment between the ruler and the land he governed destined an irreparable rift between William and the English people. Even though he ruled the kingdom for a full 21 years, a conqueror can manage a land but cannot force himself to love it. He can bind it tightly with institutions but cannot truly make room for it in his heart. For him, England remained a weighty accomplishment, not a place to call home. William's remains became the most symbolic narrative of his posthumous legacy. He died on the 9th of September 1087 at the Abbey of Saint Gervais, and his body was transported to the Abbey of Saint Féitin in Casen for burial, a monastery he had founded together with Matilda. However, the funeral itself turned into a shocking disaster, as the body was being carried into the church. A knight named Asselin publicly protested, claiming that the land on which the church stood belonged to him and had been forcibly seized by William without permission. He demanded compensation before allowing the burial to proceed. The bishops were forced to negotiate and raise funds on the spot before the funeral could continue. Even more horrifying was that the body had begun to decompose due to the summer heat during transport. When the stone coffin lid was forced shut, witnesses described an unforgettable burst, filling the entire church with foulness. A man who had once dominated the world with his physical presence made his final public appearance in such a manner. From the bastard raised in the muddy courtyards of Normandy to the dual-crowned ruler of England and Normandy. The life of William, I was an extreme experiment of will. Yet the greatest paradox of will lies in this. It can change the world, but cannot alter one's own origins. It can conquer kingdoms, but cannot command a son's obedience. It can establish systems, but cannot halt one's own aging and death. As a man, William was the most typical product of his era. Brutal yet devout, calculating, yet impulsive, unbreakable, yet profoundly alone. The world he left behind was more orderly than the one he entered, and also more wounded. Both statements are true, and they are inseparable. Throughout history, great builders have almost without exception paid the price with the lives of others in the process of construction, and in doing so, they themselves became something entirely different from what they were at the outset. Beneath the armor, there is ultimately a person. Not a myth, not a demon, not a string of keywords to be memorized from textbooks, but a specific life shaped under extreme pressure, alienated by extreme power, and moving toward its end in extreme solitude. His complexity is precisely one of his most authentic legacies. He refuses to be contained by any single moral label, forcing everyone who seriously examines him to grapple simultaneously with praise and condemnation, achievements and costs, order and violence. The greatness of historical figures has never been merely the accumulation of accomplishments, but rather the extent to which they compel future generations to re-examine fundamental questions about humanity, power, and civilization. William, I achieved this. He offered no one simple answers. He merely used his own life, in the most thorough way, to unfold the complexity of these questions on the stage of history. The person beneath the armor, the one who set out from Falaise, changed the world with his will, yet ultimately could not alter death, deserves to be seen and remembered. The weight of that crown was never just the weight of gold, but the suffocating historical weight of all he did, all the prices he paid, all the harm he could never make amends for, and all the gifts he inadvertently left for posterity combined. After 1066, England was never successfully invaded again. This fact alone serves as the most concise footnote to William's legacy. However, the term legacy often proves a trap in historical narratives. It implies a linear, conscious transmission, suggesting that everything that followed was the result of deliberate design by those who came before. William did not design English to become a global language, nor did he foresee the birth of parliamentary democracy or plan the worldwide spread of common law. He simply wanted a kingdom he could control, and to erase the shame of his illegitimacy in the glow of power. Yet the irony of history is that the institutions and changes he established for these short-sighted goals through centuries of evolution gave rise to consequences he could never have imagined. To assess William's legacy, one must hold two ledgers simultaneously, one recording the costs, the other the gifts. And the final tally in these two books is something no historian has yet been able to present in a way that convinces everyone. Historical legacies are never gifts from a single source, but the result of countless interacting forces settling over time. William's conquest provided the structural soil, but what ultimately grew from it exceeded the planning capacity of any single individual and the complexity any single explanatory framework can contain. The first page of the Ledger of Costs bears the numbers left by the northern harrowing between 1069 and 1070. William's systematic devastation of Yorkshire and its surrounding areas led to widespread land abandonment, population loss, and economic collapse lasting decades. The Domesday Book still records numerous northern manors as waste, with population and land values in some regions plummeting by more than half, compared to 1066, failing to recover even 16 years later. Modern scholars estimate the death toll between 100,000 and 150,000. Though precise figures remain uncertain due to limited historical records, fueling ongoing debate. This was not collateral damage of war, but a deliberate, systematic destruction of survival resources. Burning grain, slaughtering livestock, and destroying farming tools, aimed at rendering the land incapable of supporting a rebel army for the foreseeable future. Behind the Domesday Book's code entries of waste lie countless nameless families and lives. The first page of the Ledger of Costs was written with over 100,000 lives. Yet even on the Ledger of Costs, the arithmetic of history is never simple. The Norman Conquest ended the periodic threat of Scandinavian invasions. In English history, Vikings and Danes were never again able to establish a stable foothold in England. As the centralized military mobilization system established by William dramatically increased the cost of any landing operation. At the same time, the continental European connections brought by the conquest drew England deeper into the intellectual currents of the Roman Church's reform movement, continental knightly culture, and French courtly literature, accelerating England's integration from the relatively isolated North Sea civilization sphere into the broader European civilization sphere. Destruction and openness often arrive on the same ship. William's fleet brought not only Norman soldiers, but also an entirely new worldview and civilizational frame of reference, and certain elements within this frame ultimately became vital nourishment for England's intellectual innovation in the centuries that followed. Linguistic heritage is the most immeasurable and indisputable gift William left to the world, though he himself never realized its existence. The fusion of English and French brought about by the Norman Conquest, after 3 centuries of infiltration and sedimentation, ultimately gave birth to Middle English. Through Chaucer, the Wycliffe Bible, the printing press, and Shakespeare evolved into modern English. Approximately 1/3 of modern English vocabulary is directly derived from French loanwords, concentrated in upper-class domains such as law, government, military, cuisine, architecture, and art. A clear imprint of the influence of William's court French. As distinct as a geological stratum in linguistic archaeology, the true power of this fusion lies in its creation of a language with a vast array of near synonyms, capable of expressing nuanced and richly layered meanings, combining the concise strength of Teutonic languages with the elegant precision of Romance languages. Today, around 1.5 billion people use English as their first language or primary working language. Behind this number lies an almost invisible yet tangible historical thread left by William's fleet crossing the English Channel. Of course, the globalization of English also relied on many later factors: British colonial expansion, the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the United States, and the Internet age. But all these subsequent forces operated on the linguistic foundation laid by the Norman fusion. Without that linguistic fusion, English might have remained merely a regional dialect rather than the flexible and expressive world language it is today. Common law is the most profound institutional legacy of William's heritage, with a debate centering on how much of its formation should be attributed to the Norman Conquest. William did not promulgate any code establishing the common law system, but he did several key things. He unified the jurisdiction of the English monarchy, established royal judicial authority across the nation, abolished the barriers that local customary laws posed to central justice, and, through the Domesday Book, created an administrative tradition of written evidence and bureaucratic records. These structural conditions laid the groundwork for Henry II to establish a unified system of itinerant courts in the 12th century. It is Henry II's reforms that most legal historians regard as the true starting point of common law. William was the builder of the foundation for this legal revolution, not the architect of the edifice. Yet, without his foundation, the edifice could not have been constructed. Today, common law governs the legal systems of approximately 3 billion people, and its historical origins can be traced back along a fine thread to the cross-sea conquest of 1066. The origins of the parliamentary system represent another area where William's legacy and its subsequent development share a nuanced relationship. William did not establish a parliament, and his style of governance was in many respects more centralized and less democratic than the Anglo-Saxon Wittenagemot. However, the feudal contractual logic he reinforced, land in exchange for service, rights in exchange for obligations, and royal power grounded in oaths of allegiance, precisely sowed the theoretical seeds for later aristocratic constraints on royal authority. The Magna Carta of 1215 was, in essence, an instance of Norman nobles invoking feudal contractual traditions to hold a derelict king accountable for breaching his obligations. Without the feudal logic established by William, which asserted that royal power has its limits, the nobles behind the Magna Carta would have lacked their most potent theoretical foundation. From William's feudal contracts to the Magna Carta and the gradual formation of Parliament, this trajectory is not a straight line. It is filled with contingencies and reversals. Yet, it constitutes a genuine historical threat. When the Magna Carta was reluctantly issued in 1215, King John had no genuine intention of reform, and the nobles sought not abstract principles of liberty but concrete property rights and judicial protections. Yet, this document, born of utilitarian motives, was later interpreted and invoked to imbue it with constitutional significance, far beyond its original intent. Great institutions often emerge from worldly disputes rather than lofty ideals. The legacy of the Domesday Book is unique in the history of administration. This land survey document from 1086 has survived to this day as an original historical archive, preserved in the UK National Archives, and stands as one of the most crucial sources for studying the social structure of 11th century England. More profoundly, it established an administrative principle. The state has both the right and the responsibility to systematically understand what exists within its governed territory. This idea has reappeared in various forms throughout history. Modern national censuses, land registration systems, and tax archives are, from the perspective of administrative philosophy, continuations of the spirit of the Domesday Book. William advanced a decisive step in shifting state management from a pre-modern model reliant on personal relationships and oral traditions to an administrative rational model based on written records and systematic surveys. A step whose historical significance far exceeded his immediate objectives. The Domesday Book has survived for nearly 940 years and remains accessible to historians in its original form, which is itself a miracle. The vast majority of medieval administrative documents have long perished in wars and the passage of time. Yet this royal survey, commissioned by William to be produced with the highest standards, has withstood the erosion of time due to its exceptional craftsmanship. The permanent transformation of the English landscape and urban layout by the network of castles remains the most tangible part of William's legacy. Windsor Castle, the Tower of London, Dover Castle, these structures, founded during the Norman era, have evolved into royal residences, museums, or administrative facilities. Yet all stand on England's skyline as silent witnesses to history in every visitor's photograph. The locations of these castles often determine the development of towns for centuries to come. Castles brought garrisons, markets, artisans, merchants, and subsequently streets and population clusters. The choice of core locations for many of today's English cities can be directly traced back to the strategic high grounds or river crossings, originally selected by the Norman conquerors. Some of the castle pins William pressed onto the map of England have evolved into the beating hearts of cities, pulsating to this day. The Norman Conquest's impact on shaping English national identity is far more difficult to quantify than its institutional legacy. Yet equally profound, the humiliation of defeat and the anger of subjugation fermented in various forms within English folk narratives over the following centuries. The archetype of the Robin Hood legend, an Anglo-Saxon hero resisting Norman oppressors in the forest, though the story itself took shape later in the Middle Ages, points to a narrative tension of natives versus foreign conquerors, whose historical roots can be traced back to the lived experiences of the English generations after 1066. This tension also seeped, in more subtle ways, into England's political culture, fostering a natural wariness of external authority and an almost obsessive commitment to preserving local traditions. The wound left by the conquest healed into a scar, and sometimes a scar becomes the hardest core of a nation's self-identity. The Robin Hood legend gradually took form between the 14th and 15th centuries. In its earliest versions, it had nothing to do with nobility. The protagonist was an ordinary peasant fighting corrupt local officials. Its underlying tone of anger, distrust of external authority, and a longing for local justice resonates deeply in its emotional structure with the profound rift left by the Norman conquest in the English collective consciousness. Collective memory does not rely on precise historical details. It relies on emotional truth. And emotional truth can sometimes outlast factual history. The symbolic status of 1066 in British history is itself a thought-provoking cultural phenomenon. In the foundational history education of the United Kingdom, the Battle of Hastings in 1066 is almost the only date that all students are required to memorize, appearing more frequently in cultural references and everyday conversations than any other historical event. The formation of this symbolic status indicates that the British, in their collective unconscious, perceive the true weight of this year. It is not merely a battle, but a civilizational watershed, a historical fault line that sharply divides before from after. Before this fault line, England was part of the Nordic cultural sphere. After it, the nation gradually shifted toward becoming a branch of continental European civilization, later developing a unique island nation character on this foundation. The year a country chooses to remember often reflects its deepest self-perception. Within the historical community, there has always been serious debate regarding the extent to which the Norman conquest was decisive. One school of thought emphasizes rupture. The Norman conquest fundamentally transformed England's land ownership system, linguistic landscape, ruling class, and ecclesiastical structure, representing the most thorough external reshaping in English history. Another school emphasizes continuity. Anglo-Saxon legal customs, local administrative units, agricultural production methods, and even many underlying social structures largely persisted after the Norman conquest. The Normans added new flesh to an existing skeleton, rather than constructing an entirely new building. Real history is almost always more complex than any single narrative framework. Rupture and continuity occur simultaneously, across different social levels and timescales. In varying proportions, William's conquest was both a revolution and a transformation, both an endpoint and a starting point. At the heart of this debate lies a universal methodological challenge in historical hermeneutics. How can one simultaneously perceive change and continuity within the same historical process without falling into a predetermined stance? The answer may lie in acknowledging that rupture and continuity are never mutually exclusive choices, but rather coexist as true states at different levels of analysis. The Norman conquest was both one of the most profound ruptures in English history and evidence of numerous continuities that survived within that rupture. The coexistence of these two judgments is not a contradiction, but an accurate expression of historical complexity. For the conquered, the calculation of legacy is entirely different from that of the conquerors, a moral dimension that cannot be overlooked in any discussion of the legacy of 1066. For the English peasants who lost their homes and lives in the harrowing of the North, for the Anglo-Saxon nobles stripped of their lands during the Normanization, and for the ordinary people forced to live in silence for generations under the rule of a foreign tongue. For them, what William left behind was not a linguistic or legal legacy, but a wound that spanned entire lifetimes. The legacy of history is often asymmetrically distributed. The winners receive gifts at the institutional and cultural levels, while the losers bear the costs in flesh and dignity. Acknowledging the profound value of William's institutional legacy and recognizing the specific harm his conquest inflicted on hundreds of thousands of individual lives must go hand in hand. Neither can be omitted. Introducing this moral dimension is not about passing simplistic judgments on medieval actions by modern standards, but rather a reminder that discussions of legacy in historical narratives often inadvertently naturalize the perspective of the victors and marginalize the experiences of the vanquished. A more complete history must encompass both the institutional achievements of the conquerors and the human experiences of the conquered, maintaining moral clarity between the two without losing one's judgment in favor of either side. William's Norman legacy constitutes another dimension of his historical influence. The Duchy of Normandy was inherited by his eldest son Robert after William's death, and after decades of contention, it was eventually annexed by King Philip II of France in 1204. However, the military and administrative talents of the Normans had already spread in broader directions before this. The Norman kingdom in southern Italy and Sicily, as well as the feudal states established by Norman knights in Syria and Palestine during the Crusades, were manifestations of this expansion. The Norman kingdom of Sicily even governed with 3 languages, Arabic, Greek, and Latin, coexisting, while Arab scholars and Byzantine artists thrived in its court, creating the most unique multicultural fusion experiment in medieval Europe. William was merely the most famous representative of the wave of Norman expansion in the 11th century, the ripples of which stirred profound historical waves across the Mediterranean world. The Norman Kingdom of Sicily created the most distinctive cultural fusion experiment in medieval Europe, with Arabic, Greek, and Latin used side by side, and mosques standing alongside churches, forming a stark contrast to William's relatively homogeneous rule in England. The Normans brought an institutional framework, but what grew within it depended on the soil itself. The same tradition of expansion in different historical soils gave rise to vastly different civilizational outcomes, which remains one of history's most enduring lessons for humanity. The Norman architectural legacy stands as the most enduring and visible aspect of William's transformation of England's material civilization. The characteristics of the Norman-style thick stone walls, semicircular arches, robust columns, and imposing towers swiftly replaced the more modest Anglo-Saxon architectural traditions after the Conquest, becoming the architectural language of power and sanctity. Structures such as Durham Cathedral, the Norman sections of Canterbury Cathedral, and the White Tower of the Tower of London, built in the decades following the Conquest, continue to convey an ineffable historical weight to every visitor through their overwhelming physical presence. This is stone's resistance to time, a permanent declaration of power against oblivion. The vaults of Durham Cathedral still soar overhead after nearly a millennium, an eternity achieved by the hands of medieval craftsmen, echoing the will of William's conquering era. Architecture is the most honest witness to history. It cannot lie, cannot be reinterpreted, but only presents, through its material mass and the erosion of time, the will to power of the era that built it. When visitors enter the White Tower of the Tower of London and look up at those sturdy Norman columns, the overwhelming sense of historical weight they feel is the most direct and untranslatable message William left for posterity. I was here, and I want you to remember. Finally, the most thought-provoking part of William's legacy is an open-ended historical counterfactual. If William, not Harold, had failed in 1066, how would the world be different today? Would English, without the Norman fusion, have become a global language? Would England's parliamentary tradition and common law system have emerged in similar forms without the institutional changes brought by the Norman conquest? These questions have no answers, but asking them is meaningful, because they remind us that history has no predetermined destination, and what seems inevitable is often the accumulation of countless contingencies. William's victory at Hastings was the result of a series of choices and accidents that could have been different. The river of history took a turn that day, and that turn continues to shape the world we live in. Every English speaker, every lawyer citing common law, every citizen voting in a parliamentary democracy, unconsciously touches a strand of history left by that cross-channel expedition. This unconscious continuity is a more powerful testament to existence than any monument. It does not need to be remembered. Only used, it does not rely on worship, but on the everyday. What William left behind is a kind of historical code embedded deep within the operating system of human civilization, unobtrusive, yet everywhere. History's final verdict on William may never have a unified version, and that very fact proves his significance. Historical figures who continue to spark debate among later generations are in essence those who truly altered the course of history. The recognition William spent his life chasing was ultimately realized in a form he could never have foreseen. The stain of his birth was completely outweighed by the weight of his achievements, and the shame of being a bastard sank into the depths of history. What he wanted was to no longer be called a bastard. What he received was an enduring legacy, unconsciously perpetuated in the daily lives of billions nearly a millennium later. This was not the ending he designed, but it was the answer history gave him. And history's answers never ask about intentions, only about results. From the Norman fleet waiting for the wind at the port of Cherbourg to today's English classrooms, common law courts, and parliamentary buildings spread across the globe, history has drawn an arc that no one planned but was written by countless coincidences. William was one of the starting points of this arc, but he never knew its end point, and never will. Perhaps this is history's most profound fairness. It accepts the will of all as input, but leaves the output to time. And time never runs according to anyone's design alone. All conquerors are ultimately conquered by time. This is the final bill history presents to every power, with no exceptions, no extensions, and no room for negotiation. On the morning of the 9th of September, 1087, William I completed his last and most irresistible defeat on a humble bed in the Abbey of St. Gervais outside Rouen. The man who had crossed the English Channel, overthrown a kingdom, and reshaped an entire land with stone and words, drew his last breath on that quiet morning. His sons were not present. They had already gone their separate ways, while he still breathed, beginning to carve up the legacy he had built over a lifetime. After confirming his death, his attendants, according to historical records, looted the furnishings and valuables in the room and departed, leaving his nearly naked body lying alone. The conqueror's final moments, with a suffocating coldness, deliver the ultimate commentary on the nature of power. It is always borrowed, never truly yours. In the weeks leading up to his death at the Abbey of St. Gervais, William's condition was recorded by several chroniclers with unusual detail. During his final moments, he engaged in a prolonged confession of his sins, with the heaviest part concerning the devastation in the north. William of Malmesbury noted the profound remorse expressed by William on his deathbed, describing his tone as that of a man genuinely burdened by conscience, rather than someone merely performing a religious ritual. While the accuracy of these accounts cannot be verified, medieval deathbed narratives often followed established literary conventions. The consistency across multiple sources suggests an underlying psychological truth. A man accustomed to imposing his will upon everything may have been allowed, for the first time in the face of inescapable death, to truly feel the weight of his actions. The final vulnerability of the powerful often marks their only genuine confrontation with themselves. After his final confession, William issued his last political will. The crown of England was bequeathed to his second son, William Rufus, accompanied by a letter of recommendation urging Archbishop Lanfranc to endorse his coronation. The Duchy of Normandy was left to his eldest son, Robert, the one who had broken with him and taken up arms against him. The youngest son, Henry, received 5,000 pounds of silver, a wealthy private individual, with no land or title. Each clause of this will contain unexploded political landmines. The division between England and Normandy meant decades of fraternal warfare to come. Henry's disinheritance planted the seed of his future ambition to seize everything. Throughout his life, William had built a sophisticated system of governance, yet in his final moments, he personally dismantled it into fragments destined to tear each other apart. A man of such intense control, at the moment, he could no longer exert it, left behind the most uncontrolled decision of his life. Looking back through the rearview mirror of history, the partition of England and Normandy may have stemmed from William's pragmatic assessment of their differing political landscapes. He knew Robert's temperament was ill-suited to manage England's newly conquered order, which required sustained strong authority. Yet sound political judgment could not conceal the familial trauma caused by this will as a father's decision. The rationality of institutions and the cruelty of emotions became entangled on his deathbed into an inextricable knot. The transportation and burial of William's remains became one of the most ironic funeral narratives in medieval history. As the body was moved from Saint Gervais to the Abbey of Saint Fétien in Cassen, the late summer heat had already caused severe decomposition. When the remains were carried into the church, a knight named Asselin Fitzarthur stood up and loudly protested in front of the crowd. The land on which the church stood had originally belonged to his father, but William had seized it by force to build the monastery. He demanded immediate compensation, or he would refuse to allow the burial to proceed. The bishops were forced to negotiate and raise money on the spot before the funeral could continue. However, when the stone coffin lid was forced shut, witnesses recounted that, due to the bloating of the decomposing body, the lid could not be fully closed, creating a horrifying scene with a foul odor permeating the entire church. The Conqueror's funeral, marked by an uncontrollable natural decay, declared the end of the empire of the flesh. This scene was repeatedly recorded by multiple chroniclers with almost identical tones of astonishment, indicating the profound impression it left on people at the time. The Conqueror, who had made everyone bow during his lifetime, made his final appearance in the most undignified manner before all eyes after his death. History sometimes possesses a cruel sense of comedy, reserved especially for those who once believed they were above everything. Upon William's death, the political order he had built over a lifetime immediately faced its first upheaval. His second son, William Rufus, swiftly ascended to the English throne with the support of Lanfranc. But his eldest son, Robert, promptly launched a bid for the crown, backed by a large number of Norman nobles, who held lands in both England and Normandy and could not bear the prospect of the two domains being ruled by different monarchs. The Civil War ended in a negotiated compromise. Robert retained Normandy, while William II kept England. Yet the peace was fragile. In 1100, William II mysteriously died from an arrow wound while hunting in a New Forest. Whether it was an accident or murder remains uncertain to this day. His younger brother Henry, waiting in Normandy, learned the news and rushed to England with lightning speed, completing his coronation before William II was even buried. The son who had been given the least by his father took everything. Henry, I went on to rule England for 35 years, becoming the most astute and accomplished monarch of the Norman dynasty, elevating the administrative system established by his father, William, to a more institutionalized level. William's final arrangements had given Henry the least, yet, inadvertently, ignited his most fervent drive. The irony of history lies in the fact that the child most neglected by the will ultimately brought his father's legacy to its fullest potential. Deprivation, at times, is the greatest gift. The reign of Henry, I can be seen, in a sense, as the first systematic integration and enhancement of William's legacy. He issued the Charter of Liberties, a written commitment that restrained royal power from arbitrarily infringing upon the rights of the nobility and the church, marking an early step in England's tradition of written constraints on authority. He significantly expanded the royal administrative system, establishing the first true exchequer in history. Moreover, by defeating and capturing his brother Robert at the Battle of Tinchebrai in 1106, he reunited England and Normandy under a single monarch. The foundation laid by William I was inherited and developed more effectively by Henry than by any of his immediate successors. The father built with iron and blood, while the son refined with ingenuity. Historical progress often unfolds quietly through such generational relays. Henry I's exchequer was a milestone in English administrative history. through regular, systematic financial audits of local officials. The monarchy established for the first time a sustainable revenue management system that did not rely on the personal abilities of individual rulers. This institutionalized administrative mindset was a direct continuation of the spirit of William's Domesday Book. William built the skeleton, Henry added the muscle, and future kings would gradually clothe this body in the garments of constitutional governance. The fate of William's remains is the most symbolic postscript to his posthumous story. He was buried in the Church of Saint Félicien in Caen, in accordance with the pious wish he held when he built the church. Yet history did not grant him peaceful rest. In 1562, Huguenot soldiers during the Wars of Religion dug up and scattered his bones, with only a single thigh bone preserved and reburied in its original place. In 1642, this thigh bone was exhumed once more during another wave of religious conflict, only to be interred again. Today, the simple marble tombstone in the Church of Saint Félicien marks a plot of land that is essentially empty of remains. The man who once claimed all the land of England as his own ultimately could not even keep his own decaying bones securely in the ground. The ultimate form of conquest is complete dissipation, not glory, not rest, but an empty tombstone. Yet, this physical dispersal stands in stark contrast to the institutional and linguistic imprints he left on history. His bones were lost to war and religious strife. But the institutional arrangements he signed into effect continue to operate centuries later. And the vocabulary infused by his court French still circulates daily among billions of people. The flesh is the most fragile vessel. While institutions and language are the true mediums of transmission that transcend individual life, William left his mark on both scales, though the latter imprint is far more resistant to the erosion of time than the former. The life arc from bastard to conqueror, as seen in William, presents a certain neatness of fate's structure. Yet the truth of history has always relied more on chance than any drama. He survived assassination plots in his childhood thanks to the alertness of servants, not his own strength. His successful crossing in 1066 depended on favorable winds that lasted for weeks, winds that could easily have blown in another direction. His victory at Hastings hinged on Harold, exhausted army marching long distances, and an arrow whose significance is still debated today. Behind every inevitability lies a chance that could have rewritten the story at any moment. William's greatness lies not in being favored by fate. He was clearly tormented by it as well, but in his ability and will, prepared at every turn, to transform chance into opportunity. Opportunity never accomplishes conquest on its own. It merely opens a window for those who are ready. This law of will and preparation does not belong solely to conquerors. It is an implicit rule followed by all who have left their mark on history. The only difference is that the window William faced happened to open onto a historical space vast and profound enough for his preparation and will to continue exerting influence far beyond the span of his own life. How to ultimately evaluate William I is a question that has never ceased to be debated among historians across different eras and perspectives. Historians of the Norman tradition portray him as a devout reformer who brought civilization and order from the European continent. The English nationalist narrative depicts him as an oppressor who ended a relatively egalitarian Anglo-Saxon society. Modern historians strive to find a more nuanced middle ground between these extremes, acknowledging the value of his institutional legacy, while confronting the brutality of the harrying of the North, and recognizing his administrative efficiency, while questioning the human cost at which it was achieved. No single framework can fully encompass this figure. Perhaps the correct approach is to refuse to categorize him under any single label, but rather to maintain this unresolved tension, allowing it to persist uncomfortably in our understanding of him. Historical figures who continue to provoke debate among later generations are, in essence, those who truly altered the course of history. In the broader historical context, William I belongs to that exceptionally rare category of individuals whose actions set in motion causal ripples extending far beyond their own lifetimes, permanently altering the shape of civilization. Figures like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Genghis Khan represent the ability to imprint personal will upon history in an extreme manner, with that imprint remaining visible centuries later. William belongs to this lineage, yet his greatest distinction from these figures lies perhaps in how his legacy survives in a more implicit form. Not through the expanse of empires or the legends of cavalry, but through the lexical layers of a language, the foundational logic of a legal system, and an administrative culture's obsession with written records. His conquest was carved in stone, but his most profound imprint is etched into the invisible framework of language and institutions, unconsciously used and perpetuated daily by hundreds of millions. Every person who says beef instead of cow, cites common law precedents, or votes within a parliamentary democracy unknowingly touches a strand of history left by the 1066 crossing. This unconscious continuity serves as a more powerful testament to existence than any monument. It requires no remembrance, only use, no worship, only daily reliance. How was the identity anxiety of that illegitimate son ultimately resolved? A historical fact is thought-provoking. Nearly 1,000 years after William's death, his genes still flow in the bloodline of the British royal family, making him one of the most significant ancestors traceable by today's British monarchy. The actions he took to counter the stigma of illegitimacy, conquest, construction, institution, building, and religious patronage, ultimately converged into a lineage of power spanning millennia, etching his name into the genealogy of all subsequent English monarchs. The blemish of his birth was completely submerged by the weight of his achievements, sinking deep into the annals of history, only occasionally surfacing in the footnotes of professional historians. What he wanted was to no longer be called a bastard. What he gained was far more complex, and far heavier than that. The recognition one spends a lifetime chasing is ultimately realized in a form beyond one's foresight. This is perhaps the most universal and poignant narrative structure in human destiny. The world after William's death began to evolve far more rapidly than anyone had anticipated. The feudal order he meticulously constructed both persisted and transformed under the rule of his successors, with each generation of monarchs inheriting his framework while reinterpreting its boundaries. The system he used to control the nobility later became, in the hands of the aristocracy, a tool to constrain royal power. History never unfolds according to the blueprint of its architects. It is a structure continuously remodeled by its inhabitants, each leaving their own marks on the walls, while being constrained by the physical limitations of the original design. The edifice William built for England had load-bearing walls far sturdier than he realized, and design flaws far more profound than he was willing to admit. Over centuries, his successors spent their time discovering which walls could be dismantled and which, if removed, would cause the entire structure to collapse. This process of exploration became one of the most significant thematic threads in the history of England. History's final judgment on William may find a peculiar reflection in the fate of his archrival, Harold II. In English folklore, Harold has long been preserved as a tragic hero, the last Anglo-Saxon king, who fell defending his homeland, leaving behind a lingering. What if, in some versions of the legend, Harold did not even die at Hastings, but fled into seclusion, waiting in a cave somewhere for the moment to return? The very existence of this tale suggests that the English never fully accepted the outcome of 1066, always retaining a sense of nostalgia for an alternative possibility. William won the war, the throne, and the institutional victory, but in some corner of the English collective psyche, Harold may never have truly lost. The conqueror conquered the land, yet could not conquer that final territory within the human heart. In the comparison between Genghis Khan and William the Conqueror, a deeper proposition looms. Both carved out historical spaces that transcended their own eras through extreme violence. Yet, the legacies they left behind took starkly different forms. Genghis Khan's empire began to fracture within a generation of his death, with his legacy enduring through cultural exchanges and trade routes. William's conquest, in contrast, grew into an institutional framework that hardened over centuries, becoming the prototype for some of the most significant systems and linguistic traditions of the modern world. Violence can serve as a tool of destruction or a hammer for construction. The distinction lies not in the violence itself, but in whether the capacity to transform destruction into order through institutional building emerges in its wake. William possessed this ability, and over the 21 years he wielded power, realized it as thoroughly as possible. History rewards not merely courage, but the wisdom of governance that follows closely in its footsteps. Ultimately, the story of William I is an extreme case of the endless struggle between human will and historical contingency. Born into the humblest origins and raised in the most perilous circumstances, he used sheer determination to transform a chance victory into a lasting civilizational order at the most critical historical juncture. He was both a product of his time and a shaper of it, the highest expression of individual will and an accidental vessel of structural historical forces. Nearly 1,000 years after his death, his name still appears in English classrooms, legal textbooks, lines of historical dramas, and castle descriptions in travel guides. Not because he was a good man or a bad one, but because he was a true historical actor. With his own flesh and will, he carved a permanent rock in the river of history, forcing all subsequent currents to flow around it or stir different waves upon it. History does not forgive, but history remembers. In October of 1066, somewhere beneath the English sky, an arrow cut through the air, a kingdom lost its old master, and another man began his final conquest. From that moment to this, nearly 1,000 years have passed. The conquered land remains today, the language endures, and the institutions persist in various forms and continuations, quietly operating in the daily lives of billions. The conqueror's flesh has long decayed and scattered, his ashes barely preserved, yet the ripple he set in motion in history continues to spread, even now. This is perhaps one of the strangest paradoxes in human history. A man with no goodwill in the modern sense. A conqueror who ruled through violence and fear became, after his death, one of the foundational figures for some of the most precious legacies of modern civilization. History does not ask about intentions. It only asks about outcomes. This story has no end. The arrow of 1066 has long since rotted away. The battlefield of Hastings is overgrown with grass, and William's bones have nearly vanished. Yet the chain reaction of history sparked by that conquest still operates today, embedded in the language we use daily, alive in the legal systems we rely on, echoing in the democratic institutions we participate in. The conqueror has faded, but the conquest itself has never ended. It has merely taken on a quieter, deeper, and more imperceptible form, continuing to exist in this world.